What's up, my over 210 subscribers and the 70% who haven't subscribed yet? Welcome to part 7 of What If a Serial Killer Reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman. If you are enjoying the series, please for me like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. With that, guys, enjoy. POV narration. Yusuzo didn't have many options on what to do. The evidence pointed to the fact that A was dragged or thrown into the Tsuchikage's attack, which was what killed him. But the Reikage was not going to care about such details. As soon as he heard that Onoki was the one to kill his son, he was likely to start a war with the Rock Village. The fight would start right away. Our alliance is already on the brink. It's hard to tell if we can even take on the Uzumaki clan, as we are adding this on top of that will completely ruin us. Before we even reach the shores of the land of whirlpools, the worst part. Yusuzo firmly believed that all of that was the work of only one person. Rather than belief, he was absolutely certain. Even the tailed beast within him was only able to detect one presence underwater during the chaos from earlier. The man with a grey fox mask, the one who had played them all, he had stayed hidden, ruined them slowly as they crossed the ocean on a boat. The ocean was his territory by the look of things. He was both almost impossible to trace, and just as impossible to fight. If both the Reikage and his son were completely overwhelmed, then no one in the entire world was able to fight that masked man on the open seas. Even now, Yusuzo had no way of telling if the one responsible was near them or not. Was he still trailing them, waiting to strike again? Maybe, but even his tailed beast couldn't keep track of him, at least not while the seal was still active. He could release it, they were on friendly terms, but it could cause a great commotion, and the masked man was likely more than able to scurry away with how fast he was reported to be. This is going a lot worse than even the worst situation that I could have imagined regarding this war apostrophe. Well, the world is not exactly as predictable as you conniving shinobi like to think of it. A loud voice boomed throughout Yusuzo's mind. He could only shake his head and sigh. It was rare that Chmei, the seven-tailed beast, spoke to him. Although they were on friendly terms, they were also similar in nature, and that meant that they were both mostly silent and observant. Indeed, some things are simply not within our comprehension. Well, from here on out, it's safe to assume that attacks like before are going to be a lot more difficult. Everyone was now on high alert, and most of the fodder that could have been lost to whirlpools was already gone. This meant that the saboteurs' main method of attack was mostly rendered ineffective. But that was only because their numbers were severely reduced. It was likely that their numerical advantage against the Uzumaki was diminished greatly. Counting the casualties isn't going to be fun. But I have an even less fun duty right now. Yusuzo, as the man to discover the remains of A, was now tasked with dealing with the situation. He did have the option of ignoring it, but that wasn't exactly optimal either. He wouldn't get anything, and on the off chance that A's death was discovered, he'd even be held in scrutiny. Getting rid of the hang could also leave traces, which wasn't good. Currently, Yusuzo reached the point where the best course of action was just going to the culprit directly. This should also help build relations between the Rock Village and my Waterfall Village. If everything goes well, we won't even have to antagonize the cloud. That Tsuchikage had already returned to his quarters, while his elites were off assessing the damage done to their fleet. Yusuzo also saw them in passing, and it wasn't looking nice. That was for sure. They had started the journey with close to 100 ships of varying sizes. They had enough space for everyone. The first attacks took down around 10 ships, which placed many on rowboats, which didn't last very long either, mind you. Now, Yusuzo had already counted around 40 destroyed ships from the explosions, debris, and whirlpools. Many were also damaged badly, sailing only on prayers and dreams. Yusuzo still didn't have an estimate of how many had actually died, but they were already down to around 50 ships, give or take a few. So things were not looking great for them or their morale. But morale was not even a concern at that point. They had already lost thousands by the look of things. Yusuzo reached the Tsuchikage's quarters right away, and just as he reached for the door, two masked figures appeared by his sides with kunai already pointed towards his neck. Lord Tsuchikage is currently tired, please refrain from interrupting him. They were Anbu tasked with protecting their lord, dressed in the usual Anbu garb. If Yusuzo was intimidated in any way by the kunai, then it sure was impossible to tell. His cold eyes shined as his eyes wandered to the masks of the Anbu threatening him. He seemed indifferent even although his face was still hidden in the shadows. His cold eyes told the two Anbu everything they needed to hear. It was as if they were looking at the eyes of a beast. Both of the Anbu seemed to tremble slightly underneath his gaze. I understand that you must do your job, and I admire your loyalty to Lord Tsuchikage. Yusuzo's voice was just as calm and collected at his gaze. However, there are very pressing matters at hand. Matters that need Lord Tsuchikage's attention. I'd advise not getting in my way. It wasn't very often that Anbu felt threatened, They were usually devoid of fear, prepared to throw their life away at a moment's notice. But something in Yasuzo's eyes, in his scent, awakened that base instinct in the Anbu. Something that they had thought they lost fear. Fear was, after all, just self-preservation. But their instincts and their determination to follow orders still clashed. Thankfully, before Yasuzo had to act on his threat, Onoki decided to finally intervene, saving the lives of his subordinates. "Let him in, you two," his voice broke the stalemate, and the Anbu immediately retracted their weapons and returned to their stations, protecting the entrance to the Tsuchikage's room from the shadows. Yasuzo wasted no time entering the room and closing the door behind him with a thud. "This better be important. I was serious about being tired," Onoki said as he sat on one of the chairs inside the room. His office was still starved for their meeting. No one had the time to clean up, so he was just sitting at the end of the table. "Oh, don't worry. You won't be thinking about resting when you hear of this." Yasuzo's cold gaze made the Tsuchikage raise an eyebrow. Onoki then raised his hand, catching a scroll that Yasuzo had sent his way. "What's th-?" He spoke as he opened it up and tapped the seal on it. He was interrupted by a puff of smoke and a bloody arm appeared on his table. Onoki's eyes immediately widened, and he prepared to swear at Yasuzo and call him a madman for bringing such a thing to him. But then he stopped in his tracks, as he recognized the arm. Isn't this the arm of that cloud brat, eh? This wound. His eyes remained wide as he immediately came to the same realization that Yasuzo had come to. "Shit," the Tsuchikage exclaimed as he waved his hand a few times. 6 shadows seemed to rush out of the room, opening and closing the door behind them. They were Anbu protecting the Tsuchikage's quarters, now sent away. Finally, some actual privacy. Yasuzo sighed as he grabbed a chair near the Tsuchikage and sat down. "This is bad," Onoki said as he brought his thumb near his mouth. Slowly, he seemed to be biting into his nail, as his eyes narrowed down. Yasuzo closed his eyes and waited for a bit, knowing that Onoki needed some time to assess the gravity of the situation and run through a few situations in his head. After a few moments of silence, Yasuzo tapped the severed arm. It disappeared in a puff of smoke. It was better not to be spotted with it on the table as they spoke. Onoki nodded when seeing that. "Does the Reikage know of this already?" His voice sounded thoughtful and careful. "About the reaction I expected." Yasuzo shook his head as he opened his mouth to confirm the situation further. "No, if he did, we wouldn't be here talking. He was thrown into the way of your last attack. That's where I found the arm. I somewhat recognized it, so I hid it after inspecting it a bit." Shit, the Reikage is surely going to notice his son's absence though. He already did. "I hid this arm from him." It's safe to assume that the Reikage knows his son's fate, but it's better not to jump to conclusions for now. Onoki nodded as he looked at the scroll in front of him with furrowed eyebrows. After a few seconds, he raised both arms and brought them together, making the hand sign for dust release. Out of his palms came a cone of white light, which only enveloped the scroll and stopped before reaching the table. The scroll was disintegrated instantly. "It's better to not leave any traces. Thank you for bringing this to me. You have done the Rock a great service today." Onoki nodded towards Yasuzo. The two of them continued talking after that, furthering their ties a bit more as they assessed the situation. And while they were doing that, the Reikage was off on his own, his gaze still scouring the seas for any sign of his son. A part of him knew the bond between father and son was strong, and the two of them had truly been inseparable. The Reikage had trained A to walk in his footsteps and become a proper pillar for the Cloud Village in the future. Although A had a lot left to learn and a lot of personality flaws to fix, the Reikage was still proud of him. That pride, that affection that he had for his son, was what held him back from accepting the reality that was staring him in the eye. His son was no more. The Reikage had gotten a foreboding feeling the second that the clones of that masked monster started holding him back, delaying him, and now his son was nowhere to be found. But he did have one slither of hope left. One small ray of sunshine on the storm that raged above his head, and that was the fact that A's body was nowhere to be seen. It was a light devoid of warmth, as the masked monster could have just dragged the body to the bottom of the sea. But wouldn't it have been a better move to let it float up and affect the morale of their troops? Maybe Yasuzo was actually right. Maybe A was trying to track down the saboteur, keeping him at bay. But that went against the A that the Reikage knew. Although impulsive, he respected orders to a T. The Reikage knew that his son wouldn't abandon his duties to chase someone needlessly, especially when he had no genuine way of catching the masked man regardless. The Reikage had no way of confirming anything, so, as a father, he refused to believe that his son was dead. "There's no way he's dead. No one can tell me otherwise, unless I see his body. I won't accept that fact." And so, the Reikage took his thoughts away from the disappearance of his son. He still had a duty as the leader of the Cloud Village. He had plenty of things to worry about and work on. He didn't have the luxury of focusing solely on his worries for his son's safety. So, he got back to work, assuming the role of the steadfast pillar that his people needed. And while all of that was happening, Yasuzo finally left the Tsuchikage's residence. He cracked his neck as he then directed his cold gaze at a small seal on his palm. It's always better to have leverage. POV narration. The expedition continued. What remained of the Shinobi Alliance was now restless and skeptical. All of them had experienced loss. The headcount had led to them realizing that they had lost around 2,600 men and women. Their total numbers were currently at 4,900 shinobi, still a sizable force, but not as overwhelming as when they had started. The cage were completely stumped. They had lost almost half of their troops in the span of one day. They had also lost 2 cage and a cage-level figure, who was currently considered MIA, missing in action. But despite their great losses, they could still have a chance to take on the Uzumaki. Even by the most generous estimations, the Uzumaki clan's shinobi only numbered around 1,800 if they counted genin, which would normally not go to war. The problem was that the Uzumaki genes led to those shinobi all being more powerful than normal. A Chunin Uzumaki was far stronger than any Chunin from all of the other nations. Only Konoha had an advantage when it came to bloodlines, but they were allies. Some Uzumaki shinobi were weaker, such as those that had their bloodline a bit more watered down, but the Uzumaki was still a dangerous force. The numerical advantage was a necessity when facing the Uzumaki, otherwise, it would be impossible to defeat them. Now, their previously overwhelming number advantage was whittled down to a mere 1-4 advantage. The Shinobi Alliance would lose if every Uzumaki shinobi managed to take down at least 4 enemies, and they had a massive advantage, as the battle was inevitably going to happen in their own territory. And that meant one thing: the extermination of the Uzumaki is no longer set in stone. Yasuzo couldn't help but shake his head as he walked over to his own ship and walked into his quarters. To add another layer atop that, their Shinobi Alliance's morale was now dead in the waters. In the short span of one day, the people that were steadfast and confident took a turn for the worst. Jonin watched their students get swallowed up by the harsh and unforgiving whirlpools. Camaraderies and families were broken on the spot. After watching their comrades die one by one, their confidence turned to paranoia, as the prospect of traitors being among them was still the subject of rumors among the remaining troops. Yasuzo only speculated that there was one culprit. He didn't have any real evidence. They had no way of knowing even how many people were involved in the attacks. The steadfast and loyal nature of the shinobi in the alliance quickly turned to distrust. After all, how could they not be distrustful of the leaders that had placed them in such situations? Alas, the shinobi were still fiercely loyal to their respective villages, so there was little to no concern about them defecting. Still, there was no joy to be found amongst their troops. The one silver lining, the ray of hope amidst the abyssal seas that surrounded them, was the thought that they only had a few more hours of the journey left. On land, they would no longer have to worry about the waters drowning them. There, they would be able to feel safer. But no one was able to relax. Not yet. The waters were strangely calm, but they had no way of knowing when they would be attacked next. Underneath the waters, Ken still rested, swimming only to keep up with the small fleet of the Shinobi Alliance. He knew that he had done a lot of damage, but at the same time, he realized that he couldn't do much more of it. The Shinobi were all on high alert, and most of the cannon fodder had already been purged. Those that were left were either especially skilled Chunin, special Jonin, or regular Jonin. At that point, there was little that his whirlpools would be able to do, besides slowing down the alliance, of course. But that much wasn't going to do anything. EOV Ken, what should my next move here be? On one hand, I could try to make a few more whirlpools, hoping to kill off a few more shinobi with them, but at the same time, I think they're already used to this type of attack. It's unlikely that I'll be able to kill more than 100, which doesn't really make much of a dent in the remaining numbers. I could try planting a few more bombs, but I don't have any. I could also try destroying more ships with my claws. But at this point, doing too much might risk them realizing who I am. Getting too close to the ships in general is much harder now that everyone's got their eyes on the waters. Thing is, the second they reach land, I won't be able to do much of anything to them without risking getting found out. Water provided me with the greatest cover imaginable until now. The depths of the ocean aren't exactly traversable, only someone like the Reikage can even survive there. My partial scaled sage mode allows me to live underwater indefinitely, and I can also easily keep up with their fleet. I'm afraid the Uzumaki clan is on its own from this point on, but honestly, I think that they'll be able to manage from this point on. Their village felt like an actual fortress, with enough fuinjutsu and traps that I don't see how the Shinobi Alliance would be able to destroy it. I just hope my letter reached Yorihiko, and that he acted accordingly regardless. I think my job here is done well. I still have to go pillage all of the bodies they left behind. They're still trapped at the bottom of the sea, carrying plenty of valuables. I don't mind getting a few more techniques and equipment. My interference with this war ends here, from here on out. I can wish the Uzumaki clan the best of luck. I'll just send Yorihiko intel on the incoming army, and get to collecting my due from the bodies in the ocean. Making a profit off of war isn't that bad, especially when nothing can be tied back to you. I always kept the resources of the Dark Brotherhood a secret, so our library becoming a bit fuller won't rouse any suspicion. Good thing I prepared a cover for this whole mess. But even without it, they wouldn't have had any evidence to link this to me. The Reikage barely saw my figure while he was fighting my clones under the water. I also look completely different from how I did during our last meeting. He may connect the dots with the transformation, but at most he'd contact me to ask about my clan or lineage, since my transformation also looks significantly different while in water. Overall, this has been quite a success just with the resources I've gained. I just hope my actions assisted the Uzumaki clan enough. The Reikage and the Tsuchikage, that flying midget, are still extremely dangerous opponents. The Uzumaki might still lose this war, but at least total annihilation is less likely to happen. After the war is over, I will return to make a few deals with them. They wouldn't refuse to assist me after I help them to this extent. It's better this way. I have no assurance that I'll be able to steal some Fuinjutsu techniques after they actually get destroyed. There's also that Jinchuriki, which appears a bit weaker than B, but more experienced. I can't believe that he's actually fooled both the Reikage and the Tsuchikage. I guess I should never underestimate the cleverness of some shinobi. I did pay attention to their interactions, and while I didn't hear their words, I could still feel what happened above the waters. This is a bit problematic. I kinda wanted the Reikage and that midget to break up and start fighting, alas. I guess I'll have to send Yorihiko some information regarding A's demise. I'm sure he'll be able to use it against them at the best possible moment. Well, better get to it. I have to get my message to Yorihiko before the Alliance actually makes its way to them. Thankfully, I am much faster than them. EOV narration. In spite of Ken's momentary inaction, the situation didn't calm down at all for the shinobi. They were unable to rest, uneasiness spread everywhere as many even started contemplating how they would fight in the upcoming war. The Cage all noticed this, and it wasn't a good sign. The shinobi were tired before the first war even happened. How exactly would they handle splitting up resources after the Uzumaki fell? Well, at that point, it was more the question of will the Uzumaki even fall? Had you asked any of the Cage at the beginning of the expedition, they would have all given you a confident and resounding yes. But now, this expedition is doomed. Better cut my losses before it's too late. Yadaja, the Cage representing the Land of Keys, was the first one to depart. His boats silently separated from the fleet, and no one stopped them, at least at first. The second the other Cage noticed Yadaja's intentions, they all flew out to meet him. The Tsuchikage and Yusuzo were the first ones to respond and go meet with Yadaja to try and persuade him to remain. The other Cage joined them, calling a de facto meeting on the Yadaja's ship. But unfortunately for them, they were met with a wall. This is preposterous. Anoki shouted as the Yadaja shook his head at the delegation of Cage in front of him. I understand your grievances. However, this conflict has already proven to be a bit too much for my men. Yadaja's response was resolute, uncaring for the temporary comrades in front of him. We're still well on our way to defeating the Uzumaki clan. We still have a great numerical advantage. The Reikage grit his teeth as he also tried his hand at convincing Yadaja. A numerical advantage so insignificant that it will turn to nothing when we enter their territory. Their Fuinjutsu masters, Lord Reikage, were jumping in their backyard. Feel free to expect the absolute worst. Yadaja was unimpressed with his attempt. Even if we're evenly matched, we still have more powerful figures on our side. We have Lord Tsuchikage, Lord Reikage, and even a Jinchuriki. One of the other Cage also tried to persuade Yadaja, but that seemed to backfire on him. Oh yeah, so glad that our alliance has such powerful figures. Tell me now, how exactly do you plan to gain anything from this? Yadaja glared at the Cage in question, putting him on blast instantly. The Cage stumbled a bit as he seemed confused for a few seconds. ESK. So much indignation in your voice, yet you're the one being a coward. The Reikage didn't give him time to respond, unfortunately. Yadaja didn't seem afraid to speak out either. He turned his gaze to the Reikage and scowled. Currently, the ones that have already taken the most casualties and losses are us, the smaller nations. Yadaja's voice echoed throughout the room as the Cage of the smaller nations listened attentively. As things stand, even if we do win against the Uzumaki, we will incur heavy losses. At the same time, most of us smaller Cage haven't been left with too many forces to move. At that point, most of the faces in the room seemed to turn sour, as Yadaja pointed out a very possible reality to them. How exactly will we, smaller nations, benefit anything from this? Even if we band together, all of us, we still wouldn't be able to do anything against the cloud and the rock. Put the waterfall and their Jinchuriki in, and there will be nothing left for us. The smaller Cage in the room all seemed to be shocked by that statement, many of them taking in the information with scowls on their face. Shit. This is the worst outcome that could have come out of this whole meeting. Onoki could feel some veins popping as he grits his teeth. We have already agreed to split up the rewards evenly between us. That was a premise of this entire alliance. Onoki quickly refuted, hoping to take everyone's thoughts away from the war. That was bound to start after the Uzumaki supposedly fell. I am sure we all know that wouldn't have been the case. All of our nations have been preparing for a third great shinobi war for a while now. We all know when it was going to start. Yudaya shook his head, further angering Onoki. For a split second, Onoki even considered killing Yudaya on the spot, but he quickly shook that thought out of his head. It was the worst possible solution, to the point where it didn't count as one. It would end up further raising tensions with the smaller nations and painting a huge target on his back. Still, the fact that Onoki even considered it meant that Yudaya was really getting to him. But how couldn't he? With his departure, more were bound to leave as well. It was only a matter of when. Unfortunately for them, the meeting didn't lead to much after that. Yudaya was hell-bent on leaving, and with him went around 350 able-bodied shinobi that could have helped in the war, and after he left, the worst possible outcome stared Onoki in the eye. 3 more cage left. The ones that had incurred the most losses due to Ken's attacks. They simply didn't feel like they stood to gain anything more from continuing to fight alongside the Alliance. So, they decided to cut their losses together. Their forces were only comprised of around 600 shinobi. And with that, the overall force of the Shinobi Alliance was down to approximately 3950 shinobi. And when seeing their numerical advantage dwindle, 2 more of the smaller villages pulled out. At that point, Onoki couldn't even do anything about it. The snowball was already rolling. Yusuzo could also only curse their misfortune at that point. The Reikage was also ripping out his hair, his frustrations aided by the fact that his son A was still missing. Even worse, the ones responsible for all of their misfortune weren't even there. It's all because of that man, the Grey Fox. That was what the other shinobi in the Alliance had started calling him. The only one that had been seen among their saboteurs. The uncertainty such a figure provided made things a lot worse. And now, with the departure of those other 2 nations, there were only 5 nations left in the Alliance, and all of their numbers together only amounted to around 3100 shinobi. At that point, Onoki could only bury his face in his own hands. Just as I had feared, we lost before we even reached the shores. POV narration. Ken hadn't expected the Alliance to start falling apart. Just as he was about to leave, he decided to stick around a bit more when the first cage left, and he was glad to have done so. At this rate, I'll be able to just give the Uzumaki clan the good news that they no longer have anything to worry about, for now at least. After so many nations had left the Alliance, the ones that were left now were forced to have a meeting to debate whether or not it was worth it to continue the operation in any way. The last villages present hadn't suffered many losses, especially the great ones. But now they didn't have any assurance whatsoever that they'd be able to win the war in any way. Ken decided to do his best and listen into their meeting, clutching onto the ship that the meeting was taking place in, and popping his head out of the water just slightly. The sound of the crashing waves still annoyed him a bit, but he could still hear the meeting take place, much like he could the last one. And the meeting went about as well as he had expected it to. The remaining nations made the unanimous decision to retreat and regroup for now. They went as far as to sport white flags to avoid any attacks on their way back. Now, the Reikage was absolutely livid at that. The fate of his son hadn't even been confirmed yet. But now the entire operation was being called off. Unfortunately for him, his son wasn't going to just appear on his doorstep anytime soon. He, much like all of the other Cage involved in the Alliance, was forced to return home with bad news. A failure on all observable factors and measures. One so monumental that they couldn't hide it at all, no matter how much they wanted to. So, they decided to just tell the world what had happened on those seas, despite Yusuzo's insistence that there was only one perpetrator. The whole ordeal was blamed on a previously unknown special division of the Uzumaki clan, which had derailed their invasion completely. For now, the only face they had for that division was a man they could only call the Grey Fox. One that, from Reikage's testimony, was powerful enough to stand on his own against most shinobi, though his abilities on land weren't tested. One thing was clear: the previous members of the Shinobi Alliance needed to do some proper information gathering before they even dared to come close to the Uzumaki once more. Either that, or they needed some other way to reach it. The waters were far too dangerous if the Uzumaki were capable enough to mobilize someone like the Grey Fox and his Embu squad. They didn't know the identity of anyone involved in the Embu team, so they weren't able to give any kill-on-sight orders at all. One order was issued for the Grey Fox, though it was a run-on-sight order, mostly issued by the smaller villages. The Rock Village also issued it, as Inoki didn't want to take any chances. Even if only underwater, someone capable enough to face the Reikage and his son at the same time was not something a regular shinobi could handle. The entire expedition turned into a monumental waste of resources, time and reputation. All of the villagers involved became somewhat of a laughingstock for the rest of the shinobi world. But, at the same time, everyone became just a little bit more afraid of the Uzumaki clan. Even the Leaf Village couldn't help but become shocked at the news of the Uzumaki successfully repelling the invasion. They had completely resigned themselves to having to watch their longtime allies die. Hiruzen, the third Hokage and current god of shinobi, could barely wrap his head around the fact that not only had they survived, the Shinobi Alliance hadn't even made it to their shores. Hearing that it was the work of a special division that specialized in underwater combat and sabotage tactics didn't make things much better. The third Hokage thought that he had a good understanding of the Uzumaki clan's strength. It seems a long-time allies have hidden quite a few things from us. Although a bit disappointed, Hiruzen couldn't blame them. He fully understood their position and respected them nonetheless. Unfortunately, one of the leading figures in the Leaf Village didn't see the situation quite as favorably. Danzo had already resigned himself to never being able to become the Hokage as long as Hiruzen was alive. The destruction of the Uzumaki was something he all but expected. He didn't care much for them as allies. He just saw them as a nuisance, especially since they weren't all that willing to share their techniques fully with the Leaf Village. Only a few select people were taught fuinjutsu by the Uzumaki, and they were selected carefully and not allowed to share what they had learned. Danzo had tried to get one of his loyal subordinates' brainwash puppets to be selected, but he hadn't managed to. He hoped that fuinjutsu would become more widespread with the fall of the Uzumaki, so he wasn't all that pleased to hear that they had essentially crushed the alliance of nations that had come together against them. Finding that the Uzumaki clan had hidden such significant power also made him extremely uneasy, especially when hearing of a figure that everyone titled the Grey Fox. The Uzumaki hiding a person powerful enough to scrap with the Reikage even if only underwater was scary. It might be worth becoming less trusting of the Uzumaki in general. I should speak to Hiruzen about that soon. But no matter how shocked the world was, no one was as shocked as Yorihiko, the Uzumaki clan leader, and the Uzumaki clan by extension. Someone coming out of the blue and helping them was in itself appreciated. Yorihiko had received an anonymous message not long after the leader of the Dark Brotherhood had left. It had given him instructions on evacuating the civilians within the clan before the war actually happened. Yorihiko hadn't actually gotten around to doing that. He knew that they would just get hunted down regardless. The only way they had to leave the land of whirlpools was the place that the Shinobi Alliance was supposed to attack them from after all. The letter did instruct them to put them on a few ships on the opposite shore, claiming they would guide them through the treacherous waters. But Yorihiko wasn't about to put the lives of his people in the hands of a random person, so he had only moved the civilians to bunkers that had been built in preparation. But it seemed that it wasn't even needed anymore. At first, Yorihiko thought that the Leaf Village had somehow pulled through and managed to assist them, but that also didn't make much sense. After the war, the Leaf wasn't left in a state in which they could afford to spare any resources to assist them. Sending a specialized squad to completely derail the invasion was completely out of their capabilities at that time. Just as more questions were rising in Yorihiko's mind, someone coincidentally came to visit him again. POV Ken, now that the Shinobi Alliance is retreating, I can go back to negotiating with Yorihiko. I'm sure that the news will travel all over the world by the time I get there, so he'll surely be curious. The true question is, how much of my involvement should I reveal to him? Outright stating that this was all my doing might not work out all that well for me, especially if Yorihiko decides to use that information against me down the line. In the future, my Dark Brotherhood will have nothing to fear, but it would be troublesome if he tries something funny right away. But at the same time, telling him the truth will reap the most benefits, make him feel indebted to me in some way. In the end, all of my worries lie in whether or not the Uzumaki clan's integrity can be trusted, and it's quite difficult for me to rely on their integrity when I don't know them all that well. I think I'll just go the safer route and just imply that I had something to do with this. That way Yorihiko wouldn't be able to hold anything against me, and I have some plausible deniability if the Reikage comes to me later on. I still have that cover I prepared beforehand, the public sightings and all, which will certainly be useful. After all, if Yorihiko claims that I had visited them not long before the war was to happen, they still wouldn't be able to connect me to the attack itself, thanks to said cover. Yes, that does sound like the best idea. Wherein comes the most pressing issue. My hair is currently shorter than it was when I last visited Yorihiko. I cut it to avoid having others draw too many similarities between the red dot and the one facing the Shinobi Alliance. A good move, but things didn't fully go to plan. I didn't think I'd meet up with Yorihiko so soon, or at all. I didn't think I'd be able to fully stop the invasion after all. My plan was to just slow them down, then go and assist the civilians in crossing to the land of hot water. Granted, I didn't receive any confirmation that Yorihiko would go along with this plan, but that way at least my consciousness would be clear. I didn't just sit by and watch thousands of innocent lives get snuffed out, while fully being able to help them. That's commendable in itself. I also saved many more lives today, since I essentially stopped the Shinobi war that the Reikage was going on about in our last meeting. Well, I think I just postponed it for a few years. At least I hope I did, but that remains to be seen. Back to my short hair, which remains the most pressing issue currently. I could use transformation just so and try to make it match my previous hair. There is the worry that I wouldn't get the right shade of black though. There's also the fact that other shinobi will be able to detect me more easily and tell that I'm transformed. There's always the option of leaving and returning a few months later to talk with Yorihiko. But striking the iron while it's hot would likely reap the most benefits. I do have a theory now that I think about it. I was never much of a nerd. I do remember studying a lot about anatomy at some point. I faintly remember that hair growth as a process works in a very similar way to the process of regenerating wounds. It's not entirely the same, but very similar. Nature energy can speed up regeneration to great degrees. How far of a stretch would it be to use this energy in order to manipulate my hair molecules to form and attach to the old ones faster? Well, it did sound like a bit of a stretch at first, but I managed to do it after a few hours of trial and error. Turns out, nature energy is a lot more versatile than I had thought. I might have to look into other ways of manipulating my body using it in the future. That's for later though. After regrowing my hair back to its usual length, I continued making my way towards the Uzumaki clan's village. I also pulled out my armor, coat and mask from the seal on my wrist. I changed quickly. I'll also later have to burn the clothes that I wore during this whole operation, but I might keep the mask just in case I ever need an established identity in the future. Making my way back towards the Uzumaki clan wasn't difficult, thankfully. I still remembered the way. Gaining a meeting with Yorihiko also shouldn't be hard. Some people there already know me. It was a bit disappointing to see that Yorihiko hadn't actually listened to the letter that I sent him, but that was to be expected anyway. If the war was to happen, all of these deaths were to be on his hands. He probably wouldn't care though. They're part of the village after all. Giving their life to the village is a privilege in itself, or at least that's how most brainwashed shinobi see it. Whatever, no use in moping about it. That's just the way this world works. There's no changing it. At least I'll benefit a lot from this matter. Let's see just how sincere Yorihiko's gratitude is. POV narration. Yorihiko sighed as he looked at the masked man in front of him. The red dot looked much the same as he remembered him. He initially wanted to postpone the meeting, or try to cancel it altogether until the situation became a bit more clear. It was only after a bit of thought that he realized Ken could be able to shine some light on the situation. He was, after all, present on the land of whirlpools, while the Shinobi Alliance was approaching. Ken, I was not expecting us to have a meeting this soon after the last or ever. Yorihiko was the one to start the conversation, dismissing his guards at that exact moment. Even if they were his trusted people, he needed Ken to be willing to speak out honestly, and the masked assassin was likelier to do so in a private environment, although expecting honesty out of Ken was a bit much indeed. I was also not expecting the Shinobi Alliance to give up so easily. Ken shook his head, his long hair swaying slightly, as Yorihiko eyed it suspiciously. The only known culprit was said to have short hair. Yorihiko did consider the possibility that Ken had some way to regrow his hair quickly, but he had no actual evidence to point towards that. They were torn apart on their way here, as I'm sure you already know. Of course, I know news travels very quickly. The Reikage's son also appears to be missing. Ken smiled underneath his mask as he crossed his legs. Correct. Do you know how many casualties they had? Yorihiko's eyes narrowed a bit as he looked over one of his reports. Unsure if that was ever publicized, but it should have been in the thousands. Ken shrugged as he remembered the bottom of the sea being covered in a blanket of bodies, entire hills of corpses for the fish to feed on. Spoken as if you've seen it with your own two eyes, Yorihiko said as he tilted his head. Oh, I wouldn't go so far. I've not seen anything. Unfortunately, technically, not even a lie. The honesty in his tone was almost like a curveball to Yorihiko. He's either a very good liar, or is actually being truthful. It wasn't that hard to infer that the casualties ranged in the thousands. If it wasn't that major, then the Alliance wouldn't have disbanded / fled with their tails between their legs. I guess I won't be able to prod too much from him like this. Understood. I'll be more direct then. Did you have anything to do with this whole situation? Yorihiko noticed that Ken wasn't going to admit to it unless confronted directly. Even if I did, I would never admit to it. Lord Yorihiko. Ken's tone was neutral, speaking as if it was nothing more than a matter of fact to him. Yorihiko narrowed his eyes once more at the assassin. However, now that the situation has blown over, I think it would be convenient for us to renegotiate our deal, wouldn't it? There it was. Yorihiko smiled as the situation somewhat clicked in for him. I see, so he's not really bothering to hide his involvement from me, but he won't admit to anything that could be held against him in the future. Smart. Ken was already a significant force on the world scale. No one would dare accuse him randomly without any real evidence. Yorihiko read a bit between the lines, but it wasn't that hard for him to figure it out in the end. He's either the only culprit, his association helped him, or he is connected to the culprits in some other way Yorihiko would have to verify if Ken was spotted anywhere during the 2-day period. And that would be more of a clarification for him. But even then, he wouldn't have anything concrete to be able to relate the incident to Ken reliably. He had been precise in the way he had handled the whole situation, not appearing personally at all, not letting himself be linked to it in any way. Fine still. Our clan appears to have found itself owing someone quite a large favor. He's fought almost the entire shinobi world, and made no enemies in the process, inadvertently also gaining an ally in us. Yorihiko at that point had two choices: play dumb and send Ken out, or reward Ken accordingly and make a reliable ally out of him. There was also the middle ground, which would be treating that as a regular negotiation, but that would have similar effects to the first choice. The first choice, as well as the middle ground, would end up losing any possible partnership with Ken, the Duck Brotherhood, and the Grey Fox if he even was a different person. He did consider it for a few seconds. His clan was essentially in the clear for now. The hidden villages had squandered a lot of resources. They were going to be safe for a good while, but not forever. Yorihiko realized that his clan was still a big target. There was also the reveal of them having someone like the Grey Fox in their ranks, which wasn't all that good in the long run. They had plenty of powerful shinobi and spies, but they didn't have someone of that caliber. Yorihiko knew that the fabled Grey Fox would either serve as a deterrent or as a target on their backs. The balance in the world shifted. Our Uzumaki clan now appears far more capable and powerful than it actually is. This will certainly spell a doom. Eventually, it was that thought that helped him make his decision. I can certainly provide you with techniques, but I can also do much better than that. How about I send a Fuinjutsu master with you? They can stay at your base from now on, teach you and your people as much as you need to learn. Ken would have raised an eyebrow if he had any. The Uzumaki had never given away any of their masters, the Leaf Village included, unless it was for marriage, of course, but that didn't really count. They always sold the services of their masters. Knowledge was closely guarded, so sending a master off to teach others was extremely unusual. That would be quite generous of you. Ken was about to comment on the exclusivity of the offer, but decided against it in the end. So the Uzumaki have decided that it's better to keep me and my organization close, huh? Ken didn't for one second think that the Fuinjustice masters wouldn't report back to Yorihiko. They were most likely going to also act like spies, but that was fine. Having Yorihiko know some things wasn't that big of a price to pay when compared to what he was getting out of it, starting a Fuinjutsu division within the Brotherhood, just like that. Huh, generous indeed. I just realized that cooperating with your Brotherhood would be beneficial to our Uzumaki clan as well. Yorihiko nodded with a smile, as he took out a few scrolls from a seal on his palm. As a gesture of goodwill, I will send with you my only son. He is still young, and has a lot of room for growth as a person, but he is already a fully fledged master. I appreciate your goodwill, Yorihiko. I'm sure our cooperation will be a fruitful one. Ken shook the clan leader's hand as the two of them smiled warmly at each other. Ken's face was still hidden, but the intent was there. Yorihiko's eyes shined as he closed the deal with that same smile on his face. He also handed Ken the scrolls, informing him that they were high-level Fuinjutsu techniques. He also gave Ken a basic description of all of them, including their names. The first notable one was the 4 Red Yang formation. It required 4 participants, all needing to have chakra reserves comparable to that of the 5 Great Cage. It was certainly requirement heavy, but it was for good reason. It was an almost indestructible barrier that spanned a huge distance. No one could get out, no one could come in. It was certainly one of the strongest barrier techniques. If not the strongest, then there was the chakra draining seal. That one was quite self-explanatory, but Yorihiko explained it himself anyway. It allowed the user to place a seal on an individual which slowly drained them of chakra. All of the chakra was transferred to the user. That one was also very useful. Not as advanced as the previous one, Ken could think of a few uses for it, and, last but not least, a sealing technique called Crimson Seal. It was somewhat of a mix between Fire Style and Fuinjutsu. Its other name was Fire Release. Heavenly Prison. Yorihiko explained that the ones who are subjected to the technique would have a red seal spread throughout their body, preventing them from molding chakra and from using techniques. It will also drain them of their chakra at a slow but steady rate. It was somewhat sadistic, but Ken could see a lot of practical uses to it. Its best feature was that whenever the one afflicted by the seal tried to leave, they would only get to a certain distance before bursting into flames from the inside. The technique would seal the fate of the victim through a quick, usually non-consensual, cremation. The user of the sealing technique could also ignite the seal whenever they wanted. Ken couldn't help but get excited when hearing about the utility of the seals presented to him. I can't wait to learn Fuinjutsu properly. Yorihiko claimed that the techniques were just gifts he was willing to give him in order to sweeten the deal. And needless to say, Ken was sold. He was long before any of the seals were given, but he wasn't going to refuse a free meal. He already wanted to have a partnership of sorts with the Uzumaki clan, so the entire exchange was a net positive for him. After that, the meeting concluded on a high note. King kept the scrolls, and he went off to sleep in his assigned room. He was allowed to spend the night there as Yorihiko briefed his son on the entire situation. His only son, Uzumaki Kazu, was excited at the prospect of not dying alongside his clan. He had been in a good mood ever since hearing that the Shinobi Alliance had been crushed mercilessly. But he didn't expect to receive a long-term S-class mission from his father right as the news set in for the rest of the clan. So you're telling me that I have to go and actually teach others our techniques? Uzumaki Kazu was a red-haired and violet-eyed young man, around 1.7 meters tall, with a rather muscular build. There was no trace of fat on his features. His face and body were littered with numerous scars, all gained from his exploits in the Second Shinobi War. He was only around 21, much older than Uzumaki Kushina, his little sister. The Uzumaki clan leader's family was quite split up. Unfortunately, Yorihiko's wife had died while giving birth to Kushina. She was weakened by illness. It was an unfortunate loss, but thankfully no one blamed Kushina for it. It was rather the opposite. She inadvertently became Yorihiko's treasure while growing up. Anyone that so much as looked at her funny would be set straight instantly. He had even assigned 3 ambush squads to protect her at all times when she was in the land of whirlpools. But the siblings hadn't interacted a lot while Kushina was growing up. Kazu was stuck training himself and doing missions, eliminating threats and fighting in the Second Shinobi War. And his training certainly paid off. He was now the youngest Fuinjutsu master and a fully fledged elite jonin, with chakra reserves on par with his father. After the Second War ended, Kazu returned home to find his sister missing, sent off to Konoha for her own protection. He was young and hot-headed, a trait shared by many of the Uzumaki. But he was also loyal to a fault. He was more than prepared to die alongside his father, if it meant killing even one more of the people that were going to be threatening his sister's life in the future. He was happy that the worst was avoided, but he wasn't expecting to be sent on a long-term mission now. Yes, you'll be going to one of our newer allies, the Dark Brotherhood. Yorihiko nodded, smiling with pride while looking at his son. Sounds familiar. Wait, you mean that group of bloodthirsty bounty hunters? Kazu's eyes widened in realization. I guess the rumors paint them as such regardless. That matters little to us. I can't give you any details, but know that their leader played a big part in our survival this time around. Yorihiko's gaze turned serious for a few seconds as he stopped playing the part of the father and turned back to begin the clan leader. He didn't like being vague with his own family, but he was also not willing to compromise his relationship with Ken and his associates. Understood. Lord Uzumaki Kazu merely nodded with a serious gaze. He didn't try to ask for more explanations. He knew that the job of the Cage/clan leader was the most important one, and he didn't blame his father for taking it seriously. I knew I could rely on you. You must do your best to learn more about them. At the same time, teach them to the best of your ability. Yorihiko nodded to his son as he spoke. Of course, Sir. Kazu responded in kind, taking his clan leader's orders to heart. So we aren't holding back our techniques this time around. Huh, I guess it was about time. Kazu couldn't help but sigh as he left his father's office. He walked down the halls of the cage building, while his gaze scanned the walls. So the Dark Brotherhood was the one that saved us this time around, huh? Or their leader, I guess. Grey Fox, or whatever. The leader was named differently from what I remember, though. Kazu rubbed his chin as he remembered the nickname of the leader. Red Dot. I can't wait to meet him. EOV narration. Kazu didn't quite know what to make of the Dark Brotherhood leader during their first meeting. The Red Dot, or Ken as he preferred to be called, was a quiet and reserved individual, but he also had an air of mystery around him, certainly aided by the fact that he always wore a mask. No one really knew how he looked from reports. No one had ever seen his real face, at least nothing like that was ever made public. The first thing that Kazu did was shake the Red Dot's hand. He wanted to test his grip strength. Kazu himself was also a swordsman, one of the best in the Uzumaki clan. He wanted to test Ken's grip strength. Needless to say, Kazu almost had his hand crushed in the process. Thankfully, the nature energy-powered Ken decided to go easy on him. There were already very few people in the world that could even dream to match up to Ken in pure strength, and he was only growing stronger as time passed. He was still young. Even so, Ken was still impressed with Kazu's strength. He really lived up to the name of Uzumaki. His callous palms also allowed Ken to guess that Kazu was a swordsman, which was certainly a big plus. Not only that, Kazu's chakra reserves were larger than all of the blades put together. Well, chakra reserves didn't instantly mean he was stronger, but it was still impressive. If Ken was to rank him, then Kazu was somewhere in between him and Akira, the third blade. It was hard to tell who would win between the two of them. Kazu only had any chance of winning, because Ken assumed he would have some sort of sealing technique to deal with Akira's immortality. Otherwise, all Akira needed was a drop of blood to kill Kazu instantly. So a fight between them could go either way regardless. Kazu wasn't even a member of the Dark Brotherhood, he was just there on a mission. So his presence at their compound didn't really mean that they were going to get a strong fighter. Ken was a bit disappointed. Or he would have been had it not been for the excitement he felt at the prospect of creating a Fuinjutsu specialized division. He couldn't wait to spread out formations around the mountain that the compound was located on. They would no longer have to worry about being taken by surprise when Ken wasn't there. Suburo's sensory abilities were also decent, but he couldn't compare to the range that a proper formation made by an actual master could have. Meanwhile, Kazu was trying his best to understand Ken more and more throughout their journey, which was admittedly hard. Ken and Kazu didn't speak all that much on the boat ride to the Land of Waves. They were taking the safe route out of the Land of Whirlpools, as Kazu couldn't exactly run across an ocean well. He technically could have with his chakra reserves, but it would have been too tiring for him to do so. They only really started speaking more when camping out in the middle of the Land of Fire. So, where exactly is your brotherhood located? Was the first question that Kazu had. Like most shinobi, he didn't have much knowledge about the Land of Iron. He only knew that the brotherhood was there, but that was about the end of his knowledge. Our brotherhood is located on an unnamed mountain range, somewhat near the borders of the Land of Hot Water and Land of Rice. A prime spot for us to be able to collect bounties from all three lands nearby. Ken didn't hold back on the details at all, even surprising Kazu with how much he spoke. It didn't really make sense to keep such things hidden from Kazu though, as the Uzumaki prodigy was certainly going to see plenty of the Dark Brotherhood's secrets during his stay. Interesting. I've had a few missions in the Land of Hot Waters in the past. Kazu rubbed his chin, as he remembered the bloody affair that was the Second Shinobi War. I'm sure you've had shinobi rarely tend to stay within the confines of their own territories. When handling missions, Ken's tone sounded a bit spiteful in Kazu's ears, but he decided to ignore the slight jab. So, how many members will I have to teach exactly? Kazu asked as he started making plans for his teaching endeavors. He had the theory on lockdown, but he wasn't all that experienced as a teacher. The more people he needed to teach, the harder it would be. Ken also realized that, but he didn't complain too much. He had all the time in the world to slowly teach the entire brotherhood about Fuinjutsu. It was also better to have someone younger teaching the children. He could relate to them a bit better. At first, you'll have a batch of around 10 students. Most of them will be academy aged. You'll also be teaching the blades. You can think of them as the top brass within the brotherhood. Ken nodded as he decided to make the initial class of 10 students. In truth, he hoped to have everyone in the brotherhood at least somewhat proficient in Fuinjutsu, while also having a department fully specialized in it. It was a big dream, but he was sure he would achieve it with the Uzumaki clan's help. Yorihiko was also likely going to help with more techniques if needed. After all, he hadn't even asked Ken for anything in return for sending his son to the Dark Brotherhood. Well, their contract still stood, as in they would be able to use the services of the Dark Brotherhood for free. Theirs was essentially a full alliance, not unlike the alliance between clans in the same hidden village. There were some lines, but they otherwise fully supported each other. Ken still drew the line at openly offending too many hidden villages. But that line was going to become more blurry with time, as the Brotherhood grew strong enough to handle whatever threats were thrown its way. So, these blades mind telling me more about them? Kazu's questions didn't end there. Ken proceeded to explain more about the structure and future plans of the Brotherhood. To Kazu's surprise, the Brotherhood was much more than an unorganized band of bounty hunters, as the rest of the world was painting them. It was growing to be a proper hidden village, one within a country of samurai. The two of them kept talking into the night, all until Kazu had to go to sleep. Ken didn't need any sleep, he had rested enough while within the Yuzashiogakuka. The two of them continued their travel after that, avoiding all patrols that may have spotted them while dashing from tree to tree, from rock to rock. The landscape around them changed often, but they still mostly passed through forests, as most of the lands were lush and brimming with nature. Trees were always friends for the shinobi. They provided both coverage and ease of transportation, as jumping from tree to tree was sometimes even faster than a horse and carriage, depending on the skill of the shinobi. Kazu was thankfully skilled enough to keep up with Ken well, as long as Ken didn't try to speed up too much. They were still going at a steady pace. Eventually, the two of them reached the Land of Iron. At that point, they were already within safe territories. Ken took out 2 winter coats from the seal on his wrist, and threw Kazu one of them, as the landscape around them quickly shifted into a snowy one. The Land of Iron was cold most of the time. All of its residents had gotten used to the temperatures though. An elite jonin also had no problem with cold temperatures, but Kazu still appreciated the gesture. The two of them didn't have to travel for much longer to reach the Dark Brotherhood compound. The wooden walls were taller than Kazu had imagined. There were also plenty of guard posts along the wall. All of them were stationed. Kazu managed to see at least 9 jonin lining the walls of the village, all of them wearing blank masks, wide-brimmed straw hats and long coats. They really are building a hidden village here. Huh? Kazu had already expected to see other shinobi within the Brotherhood, but he hadn't expected to see so many jonin right off the bat, especially since they were all acting odd. All of the jonin were unmoving to the point where all of them had snow accumulated on their hats and shoulders. Even the gate guards were the same. The snow fell off of them as they nodded to Ken and Kazu, as the two of them passed through. I know shinobi are usually determined and steadfast, but it's almost as if they aren't even human. Kazu was a bit unnerved, but he didn't speak out about it, not even when some of the guards were slowly rotating their heads towards him. Meanwhile, Ken was either oblivious to their strange behavior, or he didn't care enough to address it despite feeling that Kazu was bothered by it slightly. An elite jonin should be composed enough to not need any hand-holding in any situation after all. Despite the fact that it was snowing all around the small compound, the streets in the training grounds were immaculately clean. There was a large bonfire in the middle of the training grounds, and even while it was snowing, Kazu was able to see quite a few children out and about, either training or enjoying their free time. It was somewhat comforting to see that the Dark Brotherhood was not too oppressive of its youth. But it did make sense considering what Ken had told him. All of the people present, children included, were only there because they wanted to be there. They were allowed to leave at any moment. From Ken's admission, the Brotherhood would even escort the children to the nearest orphanage, with enough space for them. It was extremely generous, considering the way that shinobi usually treated their young. And Kazu was well aware of that. He had seen plenty of shinobi of the same age as some of the children training in the compound. He had seen them in the form of corpses scattered around large battlefields. Father, you're back. One of the children finally noticed Ken, and they were then swarmed by dozens of children, all of varying ages. They were respectful enough to give Ken enough space, only crowding the space around him as they made way for him to reach his office. They all excitedly started telling him of their exploits during training, some of them even bragging about learning how to cook better. Ken sighed a bit, feeling some of his tiredness being relieved as he listened to the children attentively. I'm glad that you are all having a good time. I hope that no one has been slacking. Training will only become harder as you grow older. Ken simply patted some of the younger children on their heads as he walked by. Kazu couldn't help but smile a bit as he looked at the scene. Even though Ken was wearing a mask, he could imagine the smile that was spreading on the assassin's lips. But the atmosphere seemed to die down a bit when another person stepped in. Children, please don't bother our leader too much. Go back to your training. A man wearing clothes similar to those of the guards, the only difference being his mask. It was white with only one red slash in the middle. Kazu recognized the man as the First Blade. Ken hadn't told him their names, only their titles. You'll learn their names eventually, if they trust you enough. For now, just refer to them as their titles if needed. Kazu gave the First Blade a curious look as some of the children finally noticed him as well. They had been so fixated on Ken that they hadn't even spared him a glance. But now more and more of them were looking at the re-dead man that their leader and father had brought back. Let's just say their reaction was less than pleasant. Kazu could feel their hostility. All of them seemed to have similar thoughts, and none of them were friendly. It was only then that he remembered something Ken had said: all of the children in our compound are war orphans. I hope I don't have to explain why they may dislike you at first. Kazu was, after all, still wearing his headband, and the children weren't ignorant enough to not know how to identify a shinobi. They didn't attack him or anything. They wouldn't have dared to try anything against someone that Ken considered a guest. But Kazu still felt quite bad. When feeling the hateful gazes of so many children, even worse, he understood exactly why they hated him. As someone that had participated in the Second Shinobi War, it would have been a lie to say that he didn't feel even a tad guilty under the gazes of those that were truly affected by their conflict. The children all returned to their training, after the First Blade insisted upon it once again, but some still eyed Kazu cautiously. Ken didn't make any effort to stop them either, knowing that it would be in vain. There was not one child that didn't detest shinobi within the Dark Brotherhood, and he knew that changing their perspective on that was going to take a very long time. Hell, he himself detested shinobi, so he wasn't even going to try and change their perspective in any way. He just needed them to mature enough to be able to stand some shinobi. Kazu and Ken continued towards the blind assassin's office after that, with the First Blade silently trailing behind them. As they passed the guards stationed at the doors of the building, Ken seemed to signal one of them for something. The guard only nodded wordlessly and dashed away towards a large stone door in the distance. Kazu assumed it led to some cave system, used either for housing or training. The Uzumaki prodigy sighed as he cleared his mind slightly, calming down from the previous encounter. I guess it's time to meet the Blades, huh? POV narration. The three shinobi/assassins made their way to Ken's office without much issue. Ken sat down in his chair, resting his feet on his desk while stretching his upper body and sighing deeply. Tosho, the First Blade, stepped by his side and stood straight with his arms crossed. And Kazu dragged a random chair in front of Ken's desk and sat down. He only did so after Ken nodded. however, not wanting to appear disrespectful to the organization leader. The three of them didn't speak much, they merely waited for a few seconds before the door swung open. Kazu turned his head to the newcomers. Two men walked into the room without any sway in their steps. Their clothes were similar to those of the first blade, with the only difference being the mask. Second and third blades. Kazu narrowed his eyes a bit as he tried to judge the two of them. To his shock, he couldn't get a read on either of them. Both gave him a rather disturbing feeling, though I guess I shouldn't expect less from Ken's subordinates. Glad the two of you made it. Sorry to disrupt your training, third blade. And thank you for clearing up some of your schedule. Second blade. Ken's voice was the first one that rang out in the room. The door seemed to close behind the blades, and the two of them bowed to Ken in a respectful manner. No problem, boss. I'm more curious about how you've been doing and who's the newcomer. The third blade responded in a somewhat amused tone as he slowly raised his head and looked towards Kazu. Oh, I'm sure we'll hear plenty about that. The deal with the Uzumaki clan appears to have gone quite well. The second blade spoke in a much calmer, more dignified voice. He seemed to recognize Kazu, which caused the Uzumaki shinobi to raise an eyebrow. I doubt I made a big enough name for myself in the war to get recognized so easily. I guess it makes sense that they would look into our clan thoroughly before dealing with us. As Kazu was pondering on that, the two blades walked to Ken's side as well. The third leaning on the desk while crouching slightly, and the second walking behind Ken, standing beside the first. Now, these are the current top members of my organization. As you can see, there aren't all that many of us. Ken turned his head towards the Uzumaki shinobi as he spoke. That is quite fine. I can understand the concept of quality over quantity. Kazu smiled a bit as he looked at the three blades in front of him. Although they had casually walked to Ken's side, the Uzumaki could still tell that they were wary of him. It was a good thing, especially for Shinobi. The only person he couldn't feel any wariness from was the second blade, and he was the most unnerving out of all the other blades. It's safe to assume he is better at hiding his emotions, which is even more impressive. One would argue that all Shinobi could hide their emotions, but that wasn't the case unless they were part of the Black Ops/Ambu. It was clear that the three blades were plenty skilled. For now, Kazu decided that the second was the most dangerous, followed by the first, who was almost as difficult to detect as Ken. The third blade didn't seem like anything special to Kazu, so the Uzumaki put him at the bottom of the list for now. That has been our modus operandi for a while now. Ken nodded as he remembered the number of unrequested applications they received regularly. Many stray shinobi and bounty hunters seemed to be interested in joining, but the Dark Brotherhood's doors were closed to them for now. Accepting too many shady outsiders could prove harmful at the end of the day. Saburo was already enough of a risk by himself. At least Ken knew that Saburo wouldn't turn as long as he kept his end of the deal. But not everyone was that smart, and almost all bounty hunters were greedy. Regardless, let us get over the pointless formalities, men. This here is Uzumaki Kazu, the son of the Uzumaki clan's patriarch, and a Fuinjutsu master tasked with teaching within our organization. Ken made a quick introduction. Only the third blade seemed a bit curious as he tilted his head towards the red-haired Uzumaki. I see. The Uzumaki clan really went all out this time. The first blade nodded, his tone slightly surprised, but there was no other visible reaction. Meanwhile, the second blade didn't even flinch when hearing that information. No reaction or even an attempt to pretend that he was surprised by the reveal. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. Lord Ken has already brought me up to speed on your titles. I don't know your names, but I assume I will get to learn them eventually. Kazu patted his chest as he gave the blades an honest smile. Suspicions and wariness aside, he was well aware that he would be spending a few years at the very least with the Dark Brotherhood. Getting along with the others was certainly going to make things easier. Pleasure. Name's Akira, by the way. The only one to respond with more than a nod was the third blade. His tone was cheerful. I guess he's the most straightforward one. His reaction further solidified Kazu's thoughts about the third blade being the weakest link among the blades. But he didn't get to dwell on things for too long, as Ken started speaking right away. Akira here is friendly towards allies, no matter how long they've been with us. But you shall learn everyone's names eventually. For now, we must select your first batch of students. Besides the people in this room, there will be 10 other children. Ken had quite the list to go through. They had to select the children best fit to become Fuinjutsu experts, and since they were going with the Uzumaki clan formula, they needed to select the ones with the biggest chakra reserves. I can certainly work with that. I'm assuming I'll be provided with accommodations as well, correct? Kazu nodded as he still remembered Ken mentioning something like that before. Correct, your accommodations will be within this building. Ken nodded before turning his head towards the first blade, who also nodded and started speaking. We will set up some ground rules. The first rule was simple: never go into the basement. The second blade's research is secretive in nature, and it is completely forbidden to outsiders. You are to not bother him in any way unless under Ken's instructions. Kazu only nodded towards the first blade, already expecting something of that nature. The second rule was also simple. That was to not go into the training cave without proper authorization. Those were the only two rules that really restricted Kazu in any way. There was another where he had to inform either Ken or the Blades if he left somewhere or planned to go somewhere. But that was neither here nor there. It was all understandable/expected. The Dark Brotherhood would obviously need to know Kazu's location while his teaching mission was still active. After that, the rest was mostly about scheduling his classes and the children he'd be teaching. They weren't yet selected, but they would be by the end of the day. In fact, Suburo's clones were already watching and judging which children were best equipped to learn Fuinjutsu. They needed to have both good chakra reserves and patience, while also having to display high intelligence. Eventually, the 10 children were selected. It wasn't that difficult either. Most of the children within the Dark Brotherhood were intelligent enough to grasp the opportunity to be there in the first place. The training of the Brotherhood had already conditioned plenty of them into learning patience, so it ended up being more of a contest of chakra reserves. Surprisingly, the child that was missing a leg, Tetsukio, was one of the best in that aspect. His missing limb had somewhat affected his improvement speed when it came to physical training, but he seemed to be extremely well fit for tasks that required quick thinking and complex thoughts. The exercises that the Dark Brotherhood had them perform weren't only physical after all. They were being tested weekly on all measurable metrics, being turned into the perfect killing machines. With their consent, of course. Kazu was happy to receive a list of students so quickly. One of Suburo's clones delivered it to him before the meeting even ended. It even provided him with a short profile of each student, talking about personality, past, observed talents, and even possible issues that may arise during teaching, and possible ways to avoid said issues. King couldn't read the paper, but just from Kazu's changes in behavior and expression, he was able to judge that Saburo had likely gone a step above the usual with his reporting. He always has the odd habit of being too concise. I just hope that he didn't write anything weird in there. Thankfully, nothing was weird on Saburo's list. But shockingly for Kazu, the issues that were listed weren't what one would expect from regular children. None of the children was raising concerns about possible tantrums, lack of attention and motivation. Those weren't even mentioned in any way. Instead, most of them had the same issue and utter loathing for shinobi of all kinds. Hiding headband might be a requisite for classes to go smoothly. Kazu's smile trembled a bit when reading that sentence, but he also agreed with it wholeheartedly. It was already clear from earlier when we were outside, but teaching might just be easier if I do it without my headband on. I'll just treat this like a regular undercover mission and be done with it. Kazu somewhat resigned himself. One detail that every child on the list shared was the fact that they were war orphans, and that was really all the explanation needed for the hatred. Other than that, there's not much else for today. The guards at the door will guide you to your room. You can settle in. Classes will start next week, so you can get proper rest and make a proper structure before they start. Ken spoke out after the Uzumaki was done reading the list. At the same time, the two guards that were outside the door of Ken's office stepped in. Very well then, I'll get settled and plan things out. Have a great day, Lord Ken. Blades Kazu slowly got up, nodded to Ken and his subordinates, and left, following the clones out of the room. After a few seconds, the Blades all walked out in front of Ken and stood in a line. So how were things while I was away? Ken asked as he didn't move from his position one bit. His hand only reached up, pulling his mask off and placing it on his desk. Training proceed normally. The child we chose as your double was also not affected in his training. He hasn't cut his hair, so he is still prepared to take your place in case anything happens. Tosho was the first of the Blades to speak out, earning a nod from Ken, who was quite pleased to hear that he now had a reliable double if needed. My experiments have also been proceeding as usual. I've also been able to create a few more clones, though they aren't exactly anything special in chakra reserves. Saburo gave the next report, not going into much detail regarding experiments, but still giving Ken the more important information of him expanding his numbers. Good, at least we now have more disposable hands to use in the laboratory. Ken nodded as he then turned his head towards Akira. My training has been going well. Learning from that whack job is difficult, but I'm making progress in deciphering his ramblings. Akira's assigned task, besides holding the fort while Ken was away, was to look into more curse techniques. And to help with that, they had the still very alive, immortal that they had captured. Saburo didn't have any time left in his schedule to slowly pry more information out of him, so the task was delegated to Akira. Ken was glad to hear that everything had gone well in his absence. Besides that, it seemed that Saburo had a few more things to add. The Land of Iron had sent a delegation. Nothing unusual, but the daemon called for you again. Saburo's voice sounded almost annoyed, and Ken also sighed in frustration. This wasn't exactly the first summons they had received from the daemon. It was actually the third. They were able to ignore it in the past as Ken was busy with his own training, and then with planning out his excursion to the Land of Whirlpools. But it was rather difficult to ignore the daemon. after making a very public appearance on his lands. I'll go visit him after resting a bit. The blind swordsman couldn't help but sigh once more as he realized how bothersome living as a leader actually was. We could just send a representative like Tosho Saburo spoke out, sensing Ken's displeasure. The first blade seemed to feel a bit called out as he snapped his head at the strawman, who innocently ignored him. No, they called me specifically this time around. Besides, Tosho isn't that great with diplomatic talks. All is good. I doubt it'll be more complicated than your usual assassination request. Ken just waved his hand dismissively. In a sense, ignoring the daemon's calls even once was probably a bad move. But Ken had the leverage to ignore him all he wanted. After all, the daemon still owed Ken. He wouldn't normally go and make any requests of him. Now would he? EOV narration. Things were going quite well for Harada Yuchi. As the daemon of the Land of Iron, everything was proceeding in the best way possible. The Land of Iron was prospering, and crime was becoming more and more of a rarity, as the iron rule of both the samurai and the Dark Brotherhood made criminal groups extremely rare. Much to Yuchi's surprise, the Dark Brotherhood had managed to rack up enough bounties to discourage criminal organizations from settling in their turf much sooner than expected. It seemed that the assassins worked day and night restlessly. That allowed their nation to prosper, which was a much better outcome than they had initially expected. There was also the fact that the shinobi side of the world was surprisingly peaceful, which helped with trade and commerce. A war had been avoided with the failure in taking down the Uzumaki clan, and the Land of Iron was just one of the many nations that managed to profit from that. Now, with the nation being steered in the perfect direction towards a hub of prosperity and peace, there was one problem left. Fatherhood was unfortunately not panning out that greatly for Yuchi. As a single father, he had always done his best to keep his daughter away from the struggles of both regular life and noble life. In a sense, his daughter was a sheltered child, or at least she used to be. All until that incident. Currently, Yuchi's daughter, Harada Yu, was becoming a great cause for concern. Her requests to learn swordsmanship had gotten more and more frequent, and Yuchi had no choice but to concede, as he was a pushover when it came to his daughter's happiness. Mifune ended up being the appointed teacher. The daemon wanted the very best for his offspring, and there was none better under his regime than the general of the Land of Iron. The general was happy to teach the little girl something more about the blade, but it wasn't long into their training that Yuchi received a concerning report. It would seem that your daughter is more interested in assassination techniques than swordsmanship, and the final nail in the coffin. Yu herself came up to him and made an even more unusual request. Daddy, can you get Ken, the man that rescued me, to teach me instead? The final nail in the coffin, which was Yuchi's mental state. It was only then that it clicked for the poor daemon. His daughter was infatuated with the man that had saved her life. It was the usual fairy tale, the knight in shining armor. It was just that his daughter's knight also happened to be an assassin, and to have plenty of heads impaled on his lance. At first, Yuchi immediately rejected his daughter's request, hoping for her interest to die down in time. Children were usually quite momentary in their affections. After all, unfortunately for him, Yu's affection was bridging more into obsession, and it wasn't exactly directed towards Ken, but he had no way of knowing that. Eventually, he had to cave in. He had no real choice when Yu started starving herself. So he started trying to get an audience with Ken. Once, twice, his efforts seemed to have gone unnoticed. But his daughter wasn't discouraged. She was already becoming a bit happier when seeing her father make an effort to help her. Thankfully, the third message received a response right when Yuchi had some alone time in his office, right after he sent his guards away for a few moments to try and relax his mind. That was when the red dot showed up in his office. It almost looked like the wind had dragged him in, even though there was no window large enough for a human to fit in regardless. The short man looked just like Yuchi remembered him. The only observable difference was that his mask seemed to have a different shade of red, which was a bit suspicious. I do have to commend General Mifune. Sneaking into this place has become a lot more difficult. Probably just a transformation. His voice is the same, and there aren't many people that could sneak into this place like he does. Yuchi was wearing his regular regal robes, without the headdress this time. There was nothing to obstruct his face, so Ken finally got a decent feel of how the man looked, sensing the wind bend around his features. Features that were quite average, sunken cheeks, but otherwise even features. Some would even describe him as handsome. But that was quite unimportant to Kentucky. Difficult, yet you're still here unannounced and unnoticed by my guards. Yuchi was less surprised this time. After Ken's last appearance, he had somewhat expected the assassin to just waltz in there whenever he wanted. Mifune hadn't yet managed to strike a deal with the Uzumaki clan, so they hadn't quite upped their game defense-wise. They just had a lot more eyes on all possible entrances. You did call for me, and from your reaction, you were expecting me. The red dot tapped his mask a few times as he spoke. I was hoping you would respond. I can't blame you for not coming sooner. I assume you are a busy man. Yuchi nodded, confirming the assassin's words without much hesitation. Let's get straight to the point, shall we? The situation is a bit delicate. I'll call on Mifune. His testimony might help you understand it a bit better. Quote, Yuchi then pulled out a strange bell from his desk and rang it thrice, before setting it back in its drawer. I take it this isn't a regular assassination request, is it? Ken tilted his head as he asked in a neutral tone. I have a feeling this will be both profitable and annoying to deal with. Well, it never is simple when working with people like the daemon. It's not even an assassination request, but I can assure you, you will be greatly compensated for complying. The daemon once again confirmed Ken's suspicion as the assassin just heaved a sigh. Fine, whatever, let's just hope it won't take too much of my time. I had to send Akira alone to collect all of the valuables from the Shinobi Alliance corpses. It'll take him at least a month or two alone. Well, at least he'll be able to discern what's valuable and what's not. Ken pondered on a few more things that he had to do after he was done with the daemon's request. As he did so, the door to the daemon's office swung open, and Mifune walked in with a confused gaze. That confusion turned to shock upon noticing Ken, who was just lounging in a random chair. And that shock quickly turned into frustration. He placed his hand on the hilt of his katana, but Yuichi stopped him by simply coughing once. Now, we've already been over this. No use in repeating the events of our last meeting with Sir Ken. Yuichi's voice seemed to dispel some of Mifune's frustrations, but the general was still quite annoyed. Thankfully, he stopped reaching for his blade. Instead, he just walked up to the assassin, who was still calmly laying in his chair. How did you get in? The general's tone was certainly not friendly, but at least it wasn't hostile anymore. There are people all over the castle and walls of this city, but people tend to blink sometimes, you know. At that point, Ken was fast enough to slip by whenever a guard blinked. It wasn't even that difficult for him to do either. After all, no matter how trained a soldier was, he wasn't ever going to be as reliable as a high-tech camera/motion sensor from back in his old world. Hell, some of the richer people he had assassinated in the past even had automated wall-mounted gun turrets that responded to motion sensors overall. Even without speed, he had snuck into more difficult places, though he did have the proper equipment to help him. Understood. Mifune nodded and then turned to the daemon. Lord, I must apologize for this failure. Once again, our defenses have failed us. He took a knee and apologized with a resolute look on his face. No need to feel ashamed, General Mifune. We're dealing with someone that is quite likely the best in the business. Thankfully, he is an ally. Yuichi looked towards Ken as he spoke, trying to see the assassin's reactions. To his surprise, the masked assassin nodded. Indeed, we are currently allies. There is no reason to be too concerned about me strolling in here unannounced. I did receive an invitation, but it didn't state that I should come through the front door. Mifune just sighed upon hearing Ken's nonchalant tone. He got up and nodded. Still, I will instruct my men to be even more careful from now on. Mifune shook his head before looking back to his daemon. Other than that, how may I assist you? Lord Yuichi General, could you please be so kind as to explain to Sir Ken the situation with you? Yuichi couldn't help but sigh as the meeting finally started steering in the correct direction. The name sounds familiar. Oh, that little girl. Ken rubbed his chin as he finally remembered the little girl. He had somewhat forgotten about her after 1 year. All that mattered to him was that Yuichi still owed him a favor. Still, he already owes me one. The situation must be quite dire if he actually needs my help again. Of course, Lord Yuichi. Mifune nodded to the daemon before turning towards the assassin once more. Red Dot, I have been training Miss Yu for a while now, and it would seem that the daemon's daughter has developed a rather strange interest in assassination techniques as well as similar fighting styles. More specifically, the techniques you used to dispatch her kidnappers a year ago. Mifune was quick to summarize the situation. Techniques? I was just playing around. The kidnappers were a bit strong, but they were at most at the level of a regular Hatamoto. We assume that this interest is birthed out of an infatuation with you, as she has specifically requested you to become her teacher. Mifune continued as he shook his head, also a bit frustrated by the situation. Having the daughter of the Land of Iron's daemon trained as an assassin was bad enough, but she also insisted on being trained by Ken, who was overall a controversial figure even among shinobi/assassins worldwide. Ken's methods were brutal and effective, sure, but many had also called his methods a bit more akin to torture fighting, especially the samurai that found the bodies of the kidnappers. This sounds a bit concerning. I am not someone a young girl ought to be infatuated with. Ken scowled a bit underneath his mask as he quite disliked gaining such attention from an actual child. I am glad you think that. Although girls in this land marry quite young, my daughter is still a bit too young for that. Yuichi nodded with a wide smile on his face. Reflected on, it was the pride of a doting father, but Mifune seemed to have other thoughts. Although she is certainly young, she is currently 13, which is the legal age in our land, though that doesn't matter in any way. Lady Yu is royalty. I am sure you understand the implications of that, Sir Ken. The general didn't care as much about her mental maturity as he cared about status. After all, most 13-year-old girls were getting married in the Land of Iron, especially young girls of noble descent. Of course, I wouldn't be interested in marriage regardless, at least not for now, or anytime soon. I am not even of legal age in this country. Damn, so that little brat is actually physically older than me. Ken was a bit pissed at that thought, but there was nothing he could do about it. He only hoped he would grow old faster. So that's what you want from me? To train your daughter into an assassin? Ken crossed his arms and turned his head towards the daemon. Well, no. We actually have a plan to put her infatuation to rest. Yuichi smiled once more as he started talking. Ken also smiled a bit underneath his mask. Good, let's hear this plan. POV narration. So that's the plan. Huh? Ken's shoulders slumped a bit as he tilted his head. At least I won't have to teach some spoiled brat I can also always refuse. But making Daemon owe me another favor is certainly going to be helpful in the future. The more leverage I have over him, the better. This also sounds like easy money regardless. Yep. Do you think you can do it? Not that I doubt you can get your hands dirty, but we don't wish to inconvenience you too much with this. Mifune nodded to the masked assassin, while the daemon sighed a bit. If you do agree, I will make sure you are paid well for this request. If our plan is successful, I am even willing to grant you a noble passage seal, giving you an honorary title of nobility within the land of Iron. Mifune's eyes widened a bit when hearing his lord's words. Yet he didn't get to question that decision, as the daemon decided to explain himself right away. Since I already owe you a favor, I believe this should be enough to compensate you for your time. Mifune still seemed dissatisfied though. Accepting an assassin as nobility was quite the move. The other noble families were also definitely going to complain about it. I don't wish to gain a noble title. I am happy as long as I get proper payment. Noble title. It does sound nice, but it would essentially further tie me down to this land. Even if it's just an honorary title, I wouldn't go out of my way to gain it. That is fine. The offer will remain on the table, and you will still get proper compensation regardless. Yuichi nodded, seemingly expecting Ken's refusal already. I will go and arrange for a plan to be completed today. Mifune nodded and turned to leave the room, taking one last glance towards the assassin that had snuck past all of their defenses effortlessly before leaving and closing the door behind him. Now then, I guess I will go meet your daughter out in the field. Should be fine. Ken nodded towards Yuichi, who seemed to also agree. Of course, I will let her know to go out and meet you. I'm sure she'll be excited. Yuichi just nodded and slowly stood up, while Ken left through the door normally. That's new. The daemon had half expected Ken to turn into a bat and leave out the window or something along those lines. Seeing him use doors was surprising enough. Thankfully, the guards didn't stop him, as Mifune had already informed everyone about his presence. Ken walked through the halls while humming to himself. Sometimes, either a guard or a servant would give him a strange, almost hostile look. I guess sneaking into their leader's office makes them a bit wary of me. Whatever, the blind assassin could feel their wariness, their hostility, but he didn't really care about any of it. Instead, he was stuck contemplating how exactly he had managed to get the attention of that little princess. Hell, I was expecting her to not ever want to see me again. That type of situation would usually leave someone traumatized. He had half expected the little girl to ask the daemon to keep him as far away from the palace as possible. I guess she did seem relatively accommodating even back then, and went as far as to invite me to the palace. I guess a little girl that grows up on stories of heroism would fall for a perceived hero. As much as Ken found the situation annoying, he also was thankful for it. Even if he didn't get a favor from the daemon, he was still going to request an exorbitant amount of money. After all, one couldn't just hire an assassin on the level of the 5K for a genin level mission. Yet, to Ken, his current predicament was very similar to some of the missions that beginner shinobi was sent on. He remembered Tosho telling him a few things about them. Missions ranging from cleaning up the streets to finding lost cats. It wasn't exactly what one would envision genin getting sent on. Even worse, the genin that had only gotten sent on such missions would then be sent to war, expected to excel on a battlefield, with nothing more than the theoretical knowledge from their academy. It was basically a death sentence, and a huge reason why Tosho had ended up where he was. Ken eventually reached the courtyard of the daemon's palace. He sat down underneath a tree, shaking it slightly as he leaned with his back on it. Snow fell on top of his head as he took a deep breath. He didn't bother shaking it off. Instead, he just started meditating a bit, feeling the nature energy gathering up around him, being drawn to him. Then, just as he formed a vortex of nature energy around him, he let off chilling murderous intent, causing it to dispel instantly. The tree he leaned on even seemed to try and sway away from him, going slightly against the wind. Nature energy was still drawn to him, but unlike chakra, it seemed to have a mind of its own. It would either fear Ken or love him unconditionally. The blind assassin had experimented with it many times, to the point where he doubted if there was anyone else in the world with more mastery over nature's energy than him. Granted, he had yet to meet anyone capable of drawing it in or controlling it in any way. As Ken was mulling over these thoughts, a small figure ran into the courtyard. A young girl with shining eyes, and a wide smile stretching on her face. The guards couldn't help but smile warmly when seeing her pass by. Her features were fair, to the point where one could clearly tell that she was a little princess just by looking at her face. The expensive clothes made out of silk certainly helped too. Ken could sense most of her features as she ran up to the tree he was leaning on. He could sense a great number of emotions within her. Emotions like excitement, happiness, and a severe lack of patience, which was rather normal for children her age. Sir Ken. She brought her hands together, skipping from side to side, while staring at the blind assassin that was still sitting on the ground in front of her. It's been a while. Little brat. The blind swordsman slowly stood up, patting the snow off of his shoulders as he cracked his neck a few times. Now standing at his full fake height, Ken was around 1.55 meters, 5.08 feet tall, while the little princess was around 1.40 meters, 4.6 feet. At least this brat isn't taller than me. It's already enough that she's older. You didn't seem to appreciate being called a brat, but she was far too excited to bring that up. Oh my god, I am so glad that my father finally managed to contact you. Her emotions were definitely reflected in her tone and mannerisms, as she continued skipping from side to side like an overly excited child on Christmas Eve. I am quite busy usually. Would you mind telling me exactly what and why you wish to learn from me? The blind swordsman cut right to the chase, not exactly bothered about catching up with the little lady. Well, you seem to stop suddenly, bringing her hand to her mouth, seemingly gaining a thoughtful expression as she looked at Ken's mask. I do appreciate Lord Mithun's teachings, but it's just not what I want to do. I want to be like you. You eventually managed to get out her thoughts as her gaze eventually reached the ground. She seemed to be ashamed for a second, before turning a bit red as she remembered the day that Ken saved her. The way he killed those men, I'll be able to do it as well one day, at least with his guidance. While you was fantasizing about her lessons, Ken was taking her outward response a bit differently. She seems to have turned a bit skittish, shy. Maybe the daemon was right. Is she truly just infatuated with her savior? Well, I guess his plan has more chances of being successful like this, if this is truly the case. Ken, much like Yuchi and Mifune, assumed that you was simply lying, that she just wanted to spend some time with her savior to get to know him on a personal level. Fine, but before I teach you anything I need to confirm a few things. Call it a test. Ken's voice seemed to bring the little girl back to the conscious world as he started walking into the middle of the courtyard. Oh, anything. I'll do anything. Just promise me that you'll teach me afterwards. Yu's voice sounded even more excited than before as she skipped after him. Naturally. Don't worry. You'll forget all about wanting to learn from me after today. Ken sighed as he stood in the middle of the courtyard. He then turned his head to the side and gave one of the samurai watching them a nod. The samurai nodded back before leaving and returning with 3 chained men. They wore torn rags, blindfolded and gagged. Their hands and legs were cuffed tightly, chains connected them all together. The men released muffled screams and tried to struggle while being dragged out by the more physically capable samurai. They were gagged, and they were too weak to resist as they ended up thrown into the middle of the courtyard, right in front of Ken and Yu. Yu looked at the 3 of them with a confused gaze, her eyes shining for a second as she looked at Ken's back quizzically. These 3, it doesn't matter what they did to reach this place. It doesn't matter who they are or used to be today. They will die. Ken turned his head towards Yu, while the 3 men trembled and tried to get up. 3 samurai appeared behind the prisoners, kicking them in the back of their knees, forcing them to kneel on the hard and cold ground. And you will kill them. Ken then tapped one of his wrists, but he didn't take out a long blade or even a kunai for that matter. But you won't kill them normally, no. That would be too easy. Too quick, too impersonal. You gasped when seeing the object that Ken extended to her, a scalpel. One with a blade so small that any one of her fingers was bigger quickly. Her heartbeat became faster and faster. She stared at the scalpel in her palm with a startled expression. Her entire face was hidden from everyone, only Ken could feel the slight changes in it. The panic, the fear, the excitement. Wait a minute, something isn't quite right. Ken could feel some blood rushing to her face. He assumed that she turned red. Holy shit, don't tell me no. I need to confirm this. I was going to ask you to just slit her throat, but judging by your reaction, that might be too little. The samurai seemed a bit startled when hearing what Ken said. They couldn't really see their young lady's reaction after all. They were a bit uncomfortable with the whole situation in general, but they were given orders to listen to the assassin's commands, so they couldn't disobey. Ken slowly walked over to one of the men, allowing the samurai holding him down to step back. The blind assassin took off the man's blindfold, revealing the prisoner's panicked expression. He then removed the man's gag, allowing him to breathe freely. Please spare me. Those were his first words. But Ken ignored him completely, having no sympathy to give for an actual murderer. All 3 of the men brought into the courtyard were hardened criminals with crimes ranging from child abuse, murder, smuggling, kidnapping and rape. They were going to be tortured and killed by the state regardless. Gouge this man's eyes out slowly. Ken slapped the man once, silencing him instantly before he turned to Yu, whose hands were already shaking. If she goes through with this, then we might have some bigger problems on our hands. POV narration. Ken studied the little girl's shaking figure with curiosity, unsure of what to expect from her. The samurai present seemed to be rather confused at the assassin's intentions. Why would he tell their young lady to get her hands dirty in such a gruesome manner? Well, not like she would accept, right? Reality is oftentimes different than what you would normally expect. With not even a second's hesitation, the little girl seemed to be possessed. She lounged forward, holding the small scalpel with one hand, thrusting it forward towards the man's right eye. Please, don't dash. The prisoner didn't even get to finish his sentence before the little girl plunged her scalpel towards one of his eyes, missing slightly and cutting near his temple and eyebrows. The man released a pained scream and tried trashing against his restraints. The samurai and nearby prisoners seemed to flinch at the man's screams. The samurai were even about to intervene before Ken raised his hand, stopping them before they even took a step in her direction. The little girl didn't seem discouraged about missing once, nor did she seem discouraged by the man's despairful wailing. Instead, she used her free arm to grab onto the man's disheveled hair, pulling on it slightly, and holding his head in place as she then took another stab at his eye. This time, her aim was good, her hands precise. Ken felt the scalpel plunge into the prisoner's iris without any resistance, squirting out blood, tears, and eye fluids. The girl didn't stop there. Her task wasn't to stab the man's eyes, but to gouge them out slowly, painfully. All of her repressed sadism seemed to come out all at once, unleashed upon the poor prisoner that was now nothing more than a victim. His cries of pain, his requests to be saved. No one was going to listen to them. The girl then took out the scalpel. It was so sharp that it didn't even pull out the eye with it, so she could continue having fun. She continued plunging it, this time into the sides, slowly but surely pooping the eye out, as she cut into the muscles that were holding it in place with almost surgical precision. Although certainly passionate, she was clearly also an amateur. She wriggled around, causing her victim more and more needless pain with each cut. After the eye pooped out, she slashed only one more time to cut it off completely, allowing the mangled eye to fall to the snowy ground, which was now almost painted red. The man ended up passing out, while the samurai watched on with both disgust and fear, as the young lady then continued to do much the same to the man's other eye. Meanwhile, Ken watched on without any reaction. His unmoving back and lack of reactions further helped unnerve all of the people watching. Yeah, this is exactly what I feared would happen, but hey, at least she's not infatuated with me. Percy. Ken felt the little girl's scalpel plunge deep into the man's eye. The pain seemed to wake him up once again as his squeals continued. I think I know exactly how to diagnose this. She's simply a natural sadist, like I am, but I learned to repress it to some extent. Unlike her, I have a lifetime of experience where I just played into this same obsession eventually. Ken released a sigh, just as the little girl continued cutting into the man's eye. That sigh sounded almost bored to the samurai nearby, which further unnerved them. The little girl also looked up, her glee vanishing for a moment as she wondered if she did something wrong. Instead of just wondering, she voiced her concern out loud. Am I doing it wrong? The little girl's innocent voice and frown didn't at all fit her almost crazed eyes and bloody face. She could feel the samurai in the courtyard looking at her with disgust. She almost felt a little guilty. But after an entire year of wanting to do such a thing, that guilt was overshadowed by bliss. However, despite her momentary bliss, she was growing concerned. Not because of the samurai, but because of Ken's sigh and lack of reaction. Was she bad at it? Did she not have any talent? Was he disgusted by her inadequacy? She couldn't have that. She wanted him to be her teacher. Their lessons hadn't even started properly, and she was already allowed to do something she could only dream of before she needed him. Much to her despair, Ken didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a small handkerchief and patted the blood off of her face, fully revealing her face to the world. Her eyes were almost bloodshot. She seemed to be out of breath. Her black hair almost dangled in front of her eyes, and her cheeks were adorned with a deep blush. You did plenty, Ken said before placing his arm on the suffering prisoner's head. The little girl took her hand away at that moment, extracting the scalpel out of his left eye as well as she watched Ken's hand. Before she could even open her mouth and ask to be allowed to play more, Ken's hand seemed to grow in size, becoming covered in scales. His fingers dug into the prisoner's scalp as the man struggled for a few more seconds before. *CRUNCH**, the man's remaining eye, weakened by Yu's knife, popped out of his crushed skull, as his life was finally snuffed out, sparing him any further pain. Monster, what a monster! The samurai all reacted the same, reaching for their blades as they sweated heavily in front of the masked assassin. Ken didn't even acknowledge their presence there. He simply sighed as he shook bits of the brain off of his hand with a flick of the wrist, further painting the snow around them. That Yu looked at the scene with wide eyes. She then blushed and brought both of her hands together. That was amazing. Can I learn to do that as well? She skipped happily from side to side, much like she had done when Ken had first seen her. Needless to say, it seemed a lot less innocent when she was smeared in blood from head to toe after torturing a man. Unlikely. You'll possibly be able to do something similar. Ken didn't give her a straight answer. Instead, his head turned to the other two prisoners. The two of them trembled. The cold and the fear had gotten to them. Getting to hear their comrade getting tortured by a clumsy little girl didn't help their anxiety. One had already pissed himself, the snow turning a deep yellow as he shook and cried under the blindfold. "That's awesome. I can't wait." Yu's figure shook with excitement, her hands raising, as she then also turned to the other two. "Can I keep going?" She brought her hands together almost pleadingly. Ken considered it for a moment before sighing deeply. Before the samurai could even react, Ken unsheathed the blade of one of them, cleaving the heads of the two criminals in that same motion, before plunging the blade into the ground in front of its owner. The samurai that had his sword stolen couldn't help but take a step back in fear as he felt his empty sheath. The others grasped their blades, fear gripping their minds, as not one of them could even react to the assassin's movements. "This concludes today's test. You can go rest for now." Ken waved the disappointed little girl off. Yu's excitement may have been dampened, but she was still pleased to have passed Ken's test. Even more, she had gotten a glimpse at her teacher's true strength. He was even faster than Mifune. "Well, I can't react to either of them, but he seemed faster." The little girl fled to her room after that, happily humming and skipping along, unnerving all of the servants that saw her in her bloody clothes. Eventually, one of them did drag her to take a bath, and while that was happening, Ken entered Yuchi's office once more. Mifune was already there, looking at the ground with a dark expression, and Yuchi was looking even more grim. "I'm guessing you received a report already." Ken crossed his arms and tilted his head at the daemon. "Yes, one of my men came and told me the moment it all started. Received a detailed report minutes after it was done." Yuchi didn't raise his head to look at the masked assassin. Ken just sighed and sat down on a tatami mat nearby. Yuchi's voice was interrupted by Mifune's booming voice. "Why would you let her go through with it?" The general sounded almost personally insulted. "It couldn't be helped after all. The general saw you as his granddaughter." He didn't like the thought of her staining her hands in such a gruesome manner. He was angry, frustrated, and he didn't have anyone to take out that frustration on. No one besides Ken, that is, who could technically be blamed for the escalated brutality of their plan. General Mifune. Yuchi sighed when hearing his general's angered tone, but he didn't try to calm him down. He did want to hear Ken's answer first. "Why? Huh?" Ken shook his head when hearing that question, lamenting its stupidity before signing once more. "I can't expect them to know what it's like. It was a gamble, of sorts, a test." Ken's voice made Yuchi raise an eyebrow. As a father, he could feel anger boiling in his veins, but as a leader, he knew that he couldn't lash out at Ken. "A gamble, you tarnished lady, used purity for a gamble." Mifune was less restrained though. He was a powerful samurai, unafraid of anyone and anything. "Sorry to say this, but there's not much purity to be found in her." Ken's words seemed to grate Mifune further. The general took out his katana, seemingly resolved to die, if it meant taking down the man that had just insulted his perceived granddaughter. This time, Yuchi calmed him down. He did so by wordlessly walking in between him and Ken. He didn't take Ken's words as an insult. He knew that the assassin wasn't the type to throw baseless insults around. He looked at the assassin with a stony expression before opening his mouth. "What do you mean by that?" Yuchi's eyes were cold. His tone betrayed his true feelings. Anxiety, fear, concern. "At least he's a good father. Maybe Yu's fate isn't bound to be the same as mine." Ken shook his head before opening his mouth once more. "No one is that eager on their first kill, let alone their first time torturing someone, that is, unless they've played out that same scenario a million times before in their minds. Even then, it would be difficult for a greenhorn to replicate what she just did. She has a talent for this, much like I do." With each sentence that came out, Yuchi's concern grew more and more. Mifune also put his blade down, his anger being snuffed out by a similar feeling to that of the daemon. It wasn't far-fetched to say she had talent. When it came to killing, one's mentality was one of the most important factors, and she seemed to have no qualms about getting her hands dirty. "So little you wanted to do such a thing for a while now." But how?" Yuchi looked at Ken with wide eyes, his tone resembling that of a concerned father. More and more, as his stony exterior broke completely. Children being accustomed to killing and torture wasn't all that uncommon in that world, especially amongst shinobi, but you have been specifically sheltered from that since birth. She was the jewel in Yuchi's eyes, and he couldn't bear the thought that his upbringing may have brought her to a point where she became a bloodthirsty maniac. "You tell me, how long has she wanted to get involved in this world? How long ago did she request to be trained?" Ken slowly sat up and stood face to face with the daemon, turning his head up to him and pretending to look him in the eye. Around the same time the kidnapping happened, Yuchi's own eyes widened as he listened to his own words. "Don't tell me." Mifune's eyes also widened as he also reached a conclusion on his own. Regardless, Ken was there to clarify things for them. Speaking from experience, that was her breakthrough. The first glimpse she had of this world, she was captivated by it. Enamored with it, not with me. At that moment, Yuchi's shoulders slumped. "So it all comes down to that, huh?" He had tried to ignore it. He had done his best to think that the attempted kidnapping hadn't affected his daughter that badly, but he couldn't deny the reality staring him in the eye. His daughter was shaping up to be a true sadist, someone that found true pleasure in death and inflicting pain. The exact same type of person he had sought to shield her from in the past. What do I do? Was the first question that reached his mind. Behind him, Mifune sheathed his blade, his gaze resolute, his teeth clenched together. Yuichi struggled a bit internally. The first thing he figured was to try and help her suppress her urges, to try and shield her from herself essentially, to do just like he had done before, but better. Unfortunately, he now knew that such a thing was impossible. He couldn't shield his daughter at all times from everything. One day he would also no longer be there for her. She needed to somehow be able to stand on her own. What do I do? This time, the question was less pronounced, almost as if he was losing his energy gradually. For a split second, the thought of imprisoning her came to mind to keep everyone else safe from her, from the monster she was bound to become. But he quickly discarded it. No, even if she's like this, she's still my daughter. I will love and support her through this. Maybe it's just a phase at that point. Ken could almost guess the thoughts going through his head. The assassin took another step forward, his arm reaching up and patting the daemon's shoulder. I know this is hard to come to terms with. I understand how this would be difficult to see. But you need to understand that this won't change. Yuichi looked towards Ken once more, his gaze discouraged, his eyes downcast. The assassin ignored the emotions flowing out of the father as he continued. Today's events prove that she's too far gone already. If it hadn't happened, she would have likely found another outlet, maybe an animal, maybe a servant. But it is inevitable. The very thought seemed to send a shiver down Yuichi's spine. Behind him, Mifune's shoulders also slumped. He now understood the situation fully, and he naturally blamed himself for it. Maybe if I gave her more guards, if her background checks were more thorough, if I actually managed to teach her swordsmanship beforehand, teach her self-restraint. Alas, perfection wasn't ever going to be achievable. They had done everything possible in order to shelter her, all in vain. Everything was ruined by one half-baked plot made by a few somewhat powerful kidnappers. So what can I do now? In the end, the father couldn't help but seek advice from Ken. It was safe to say that Ken was speaking from experience. Even Mifune marveled at how he was able to dissect the situation and understand you with such precision. And unlike them, he wasn't just speculating that she was infatuated with something. He had proof. The true question is, how much do you love your daughter? Ken's voice sounded almost comforting, as if he was making an effort to sympathize with the father's plight. More than anything else in this world, she is all I have, Yuichi answered earnestly. He no longer cared about his position. He no longer cared that he was speaking to a suspicious individual. Thanks to that, the blind assassin realized just how serious Yuichi was. Good, she has a support network of sorts to fall back on at least. The assassin paced around the room for a few seconds, thinking about his next words for a bit, contemplating the best course of action for himself. I could take care of her. No, I should do that. The daemon would both be eternally grateful to me, and I would shield the world from her, teach her properly, direct her sadism properly. We need to teach her. There's no use in teaching her restraint at this point in her life. Hell, it's likely impossible. I tried to restrain myself plenty while in my youth. It just made the spree a lot more brutal for my victims. She likely tried restraining herself for a year. Already today was when she got to let off some steam. Mifune spoke out this time, sighing in frustration as he sat back down, gripping his knees with a grave expression. Indeed, the most we can do is teach her how to use her talents accordingly. I will take her under my wing, turn her into a sharp blade, one that won't be pointed at innocent lives. Yuichi looked at Ken with wide eyes. Through all the concern and fear, he could feel some relief as well. You would do that. The daemon was clearly desperate. Being helpless when it came to taking care of his daughter was grueling for him. Mifune opened his mouth. He was likely reflexively going to reject Ken's offer, but can I claim to train her as well as he can? I already tried during the past year. I failed constantly. I couldn't even grasp her true desires. His own inadequacies were what stopped him from speaking out. I will do it. Ken ended up answering the daemon. It seems I have more work in the future, but I also technically have the land of iron in the palm of my hand. Now I would say it is worth the hassle. EOV narration. Is something wrong, father? Yu's voice rang out as she stood before her father inside his office. She was dressed in new clothes, all blood was washed off. She now looked just like before, as if nothing at all had happened. Behind the daemon stood Mifune and Ken, shoulder to shoulder, well, close to that at least. Mifune was still taller than Ken by quite a bit, at least while Ken's transformation was still active. We need to talk about what happened in the courtyard earlier. Yuichi's voice sounded serious. His expression told little Yu that the situation was no laughing matter. Did I do something wrong was the first thought in her mind. It wasn't that she didn't realize that gouging out someone's eyeballs was wrong. She wanted to do it either way, and she thought that she wasn't going to get in trouble. if she was following Ken's orders. Was Sir Ken's orders not approved by father? Would I be able to blame him for that? Then her mind was running on overdrive. The last thing she wanted was for her father to look at her in a bad light. She was prepared to sacrifice anything in order to avoid that. Mifune and Yuchi could both read her mind just from seeing the frantic look in her eyes. The slightly panicked expression was currently etched into her face. Still, they waited for her response. Yes, father, did I disappoint you? It was a question that could have had many meanings. It was exactly the question that the three of them were expecting to receive from her. On one hand, it could be that she was asking if she was disappointed in her performance during Ken's test. Either she had done badly, or she had done too well after all. It could be that she was concerned she may have disappointed her father by letting her bloodlust show to such an extent, by getting carried away at the moment and letting loose on the prisoner in a manner not befitting royalty. Here was the crucial part. I should do as Ken instructed here. He's the one with more experience when dealing with such things, even if it feels wrong. No dear, in fact, it's the opposite. You went above and beyond what we may have expected. Encouragement from a father figure. Yuchi couldn't help but question himself internally. Was he really right in encouraging such a talent, letting her grow? But Ken thought otherwise. It's important that no matter what she does, she feels like she can rely on you, that she'll always have someone to fall back on. You need to do this if you want to keep your relationship with her intact. Ken's words rang in Yuchi's mind. It was clear that the assassin knew what he was talking about. Even Mifune seemed to agree. It was the most diplomatic approach to the situation after all. But it still felt wrong. Thank you, father. Yu squealed a bit as she ran up to her father, almost jumping over his desk and landing in his now open arms. Yuchi's feelings swiftly vanished when he embraced his daughter. The daemon observed Yu's reaction, and his expression immediately softened. A large smile spread across her cheeks as she buried her head in his chest. Her entire face lit up as her eyes seemed to regain their life. Yuchi's eyes widened for a second. He couldn't help it. Even with all of his pampering, he hadn't seen Yu that happy ever since her mother passed. Ken was right in the end. I can't afford to lose my daughter. Yuchi patted his young daughter's head with a warm smile on his face. At that moment, he couldn't help but feel thankful for Ken's intervention. Who knows what could have happened without him here? I already owed him a favor, but this goes beyond that. Being able to see you smile. This is a debt that I can't ever pay back. The father and daughter duo hugged for a bit more. Ken and Mifune stood unmoving during that time. Mifune sometimes glanced at the assassin. He wasn't fully okay with Ken also being allowed to stand by the daemon's side, since he was still technically an outsider. But now that Ken was to be taking care of you, it was simply a waste of time to mistrust him. It was also hard for Mifune to be mad at Ken when seeing Yu's smile. If he had any bad intentions, he already had a lot of chances to act out on them. Even if he has more ulterior motives, he's already proven to be an ally. The samurai sighed a bit before his gaze rested back on the daemon and Yu. Meanwhile, Ken was contemplating how the training was going to be done. He did propose that Yu would come to his compound and live there for a few years. But Yuchi wasn't fully okay with not seeing his daughter for that long, which was completely understandable. We might end up with a schedule where she returns home once or twice a month, but I sure as hell am not wasting all of my time here. Ken shook his head before his senses fixated on the little girl for a moment. Her first kill, huh? Even if he had been the one to technically finish off the prisoner, she was the one that had killed him. She did the most damage essentially. Ken couldn't help but sigh internally as he remembered his very own first kill. He was older than Yu when it happened. He couldn't remember exactly by how much, but he remembered the details of it perfectly. His reaction wasn't that much different from Yu's either. The thrill of drawing that first blood was what got me hooked. It all started with a drunken fool one merry night. He may have been violent and gotten himself kicked out of a bar, or maybe his wife kicked him out of the home because of his drinking. None of that mattered. What mattered was that he stumbled upon Ken, or Joseph, that merry night. Ken remembered how he had gutted the man with a switchblade, how he had stuffed some trash in his mouth to keep him from screaming out while he was bleeding like a pig. In retrospect, Yu's first kill might have been better. It was neither as messy, nor was it involving a random drunk passerby. Ken didn't exactly take pride in what he had done. Not that he ever had, but it was thrilling, to say the least. That guilt was what drove him to aim higher, to go for people that actually deserved to die, at least by his standards. He also killed plenty of good people, cops, detectives, and even some good politicians. It was either for money, pleasure, or by mistake. Money was nothing more than an object to Ken regardless. It was just a way to keep his spree going for longer. He did become the best assassin for hire, and even became filthy rich, but the blood of innocence that stained his hands still made him ashamed of his past. As for the countless others, who cares anyway? Snake dying in the snake pit wasn't worth crying over. It was only a shame whenever someone that didn't belong fell in. Ken sensed the girl's happiness once more. It was even more concentrated than when she was torturing that criminal. I'll make sure she won't have to live with such regrets, make it so she'll always be able to justify her actions, while also satisfying her needs. While the blind swordsman was mulling over his thoughts, Yuichi decided to finally continue his pre-planned speech. Little Yu the demon patted his daughter's hair once more before he cupped her cheek and turned her gaze to meet his. Lord Ken vouched for your talent. He was even impressed by it, to the point where he wishes to help you develop it properly. Do you accept his guidance? Yu seemed more and more excited with every sentence that her father spoke. But before she could accept, her father continued. By accepting, you will leave with him, and you will learn from him. You can't complain to him about your treatment, nor will you receive special treatment compared to his other students. Yuichi kept his expression unchanged. He wasn't fully on board with the idea either. It was hard for a father to let his young daughter wander off at the end of the day. In the end, Yuichi and Mifune realized that Yu would live alongside the other youngsters in the Duck Brotherhood. They wouldn't be able to shelter her at all, and she would have to get used to a significantly different way of life in the end. It all hinged on her. Was her determination to learn and develop large enough to give up her current life? Well, I accept. Her voice rang out with clarity. Her answer was exactly what Ken had expected. There was no hesitation in the girl's voice. Her features were still just as happy and excited as before. In fact, she hugged her father once more, thankful for the opportunity he was giving her. Thank you for letting me do this, Father. Yu snuggled up to her father once more as she spoke out. She also turned and looked at Ken with an almost euphoric expression. She mentally thanked the assassin that had also made it all possible. You're more than welcome, Yu. Just promise to visit me from time to time. Don't forget about your old man. Yuichi ended the speech on a high note. A wide smile spread on his face as he slowly wrapped his hand around his daughter one last time. The two of them stayed like that for a few more minutes, before Yuichi sighed and slowly softened up, his daughter also getting up and walking in front of his table, facing her father with a resolute gaze. So when are we leaving? Her confidence was skyrocketing, and Yuichi sighed a bit when seeing her. Now, you have 10 minutes to pack your bags, not 1 second more. Grab only essentials. I will throw away anything that's unnecessary. Ken was the one to respond this time, as he stepped forward and walked by Yuichi's desk. Yu's eyes widened when she heard his answer. The little girl immediately started leaving her father's office in a hurry, only stopping to bow to the people inside before running away. Silence stretched in the room for a few seconds, before Yuichi sighed and turned his head towards Ken. Please take care of my daughter, Ken. I'll send a delegation whenever I want her to visit. They'll take care of bringing her safely to me. You don't have to bother yourself with that. The blind assassin merely nodded at the daemon's words. Very well, I'll make sure no harm comes to her. Training will still be harsh, but I'm sure she can take it. It seems you raised a strong girl. The assassin then started walking away. Yuichi's gaze traced his steps as he closed the door behind him. Mifune sighed a bit as he finally spoke out. I assume you want someone to follow them. The daemon looked at his general, seemingly pondering about it for a second before shaking his head. No, it's no use. Lord Ken would certainly notice if he was being tracked, and I doubt there's anything that can harm her while she's with him. The general frowned a bit when hearing that, but he didn't protest in the end. From here on out, Yu's fate lies in that man's hands. At least she won't turn into a tyrannical noble and a serial killer. And so, Ken's meeting with the daemon ended on a high note. The blind swordsman's payment was still set to be sent to him during the next check-in of the daemon's delegation. It was going to contain a rather substantial sum, as Ken had gone above and beyond this time around. But no amount of money was going to change the fact that Yuichi now was indebted to Ken. Any and all plots that the daemon may have been cooking up were now erased in an instant. What are the chances of Lord Ken using the front door to leave this time around? The daemon turned to his general for a second. Very low. He's probably just going to jump the walls with the young lady on his back. Mifune sighed as he remembered the assassin's habit of ignoring regular customs. Please make sure to inform the samurai that Yu is leaving with him. We don't need any misunderstandings to happen now naturally. Mifune also left the room after that to inform his troops of the development. And finally, the daemon was left alone with his thoughts. POV Lord Ken can only really be described as a strict teacher. It's only been a day since we've left the capital. 1 day since I've left the safe confines of my father's palace, and I'm already having to struggle to catch my own food in the wild. Lord Ken still gave me the appropriate knowledge, told me how some animals behaved, how to successfully corner them, where their most vital spots are. It was basic knowledge, the type I'm used to cramming already. I could tell Lord Ken appreciated how quickly I picked up on what he taught me. Even if he didn't outright praise me, I could still feel it. So I had some of the basics down now, at least the bare minimum for survival in the wild. But I still clearly lack practice. Lord Mifune's training did prepare me for combat, but it was always fighting on an even, pristine training ground. Fighting in a forest provides its own obstacles, but I am willing to grit my teeth and power through it all. if it means getting more opportunities to learn his art, the art of killing. I can't help but think of it as a form of expression, especially after getting to do it myself. I am still a bit disappointed that I wasn't able to finish off that prisoner, but I will certainly get the opportunity by following Lord Ken. For now, I'll still settle for hunting down rabbits. Skinning them is actually pretty fun, although I was a bit hesitant at first. Lord Ken said it helps me with my precision and dexterity, which I will certainly need a lot of in the future. Rabbit meat is actually really delicious. Maybe it just tasted better because I caught it and made it with my own hands. Regardless, I am glad I received this opportunity, and I only have one man to thank for that. Said man is currently just sitting on a sturdy branch, seemingly looking down at my little makeshift campsite while resting. I can't tell if he's actually sleeping or not, but I've yet to actually see him tired. It's hard to tell, since I've not even seen his face. Yet I'm sure I'll get to see it soon. I can barely wait. Someone that can produce such beautiful art will surely look handsome. Although, I don't know would that even fit the art he practices. This form of art is certainly what my calligraphy teacher would call grotesque whatever. He is the master, I am the student. His appearances don't matter in any way. Yeah, Lord Ken's next lesson is what matters most. Especially to me. Wire traps and how to set them up efficiently. Ever since that incident, I have had this fascination with wires. The way they can be used to manipulate flesh is to string up bodies. It was simply amazing, but I was never able to try anything with them. I was too shy to ask my father for them. I was afraid he wouldn't like my fixation on them too. Looking back, I think I could have just asked him. He clearly cares about me regardless of what I do. He's the best father I could have asked for. Now, unfortunately for me, Lord Ken is only teaching me the basics regarding those as well. I did insist on learning more, but his exact words were, "Never ask for more, dear student, especially when you're not even close to mastering the basics." My rebellious nature led to me pouting a bit at that, and Lord Ken decided to make my lack of knowledge extremely clear. A small demonstration was all he needed. He showed me how a basic wire trap was more than enough to trap a person and leave them helpless, and that person was me. I was entangled and hung upside down before I even realized what was happening. Thankfully, I was wearing proper training clothes, not a skirt. That would have been embarrassing. But I highly doubt Lord Ken would have been too moved by the sight of my panties. Despite the fact that I am already at a marriageable age, Lord Ken still treats me like a complete child. I like it. It just goes to show how far ahead of me he is. Be it in his mastery of the art, or in his maturity, he is far above me. But oh, I will catch up. I can only dream of the day I finally get him to acknowledge me. But that is going to take a lot of time and dedication. Thankfully, I am young, so I have time. And I am nothing if not dedicated. Our journey lasted a few more days after the wire trap incident. During those days, Lord Ken continued to teach me more and more about survival, and even chakra molding. He even gave me the manual for the 3 basic ninjutsu that shinobi use. Apparently, despite not being an actual shinobi, Lord Ken uses shinobi arts too, and even claims they can be crucial to survival at times. Thankfully, I was able to impress him a bit with my chakra control. I trained diligently with Lord Mifune. I am not able to imbue an object with chakra yet. My external control is almost non-existent, but I can do the basic training exercises for chakra control. I can even stick to a tree trunk for a few seconds. But my lacking external control didn't seem to matter to Lord Ken. He was impressed enough that I am able to control the chakra within my body. This makes things a lot easier. But external chakra control will be a necessity for proper shinobi arts, as well as other techniques I'll be teaching you. So I got to work, molding chakra with hand signs and doing various exercises that were in the book Lord Ken gifted me. And before I knew it, we reached a rather large fortress in the middle of a mountain range. Large wooden walls surrounded 24 buildings of varying sizes. "We're here." Lord Ken patted me on the head and continued walking. The gates were guarded by masked men, who didn't even glance at us as we passed by. They were almost like statues. They seem to be protecting the village. I can see them posted up on watchtowers too. From their robotic movements and trained postures, I can already tell this place is going to be a lot of fun. EOV narration: Ken had met many people in his 2 lives. He had met hypocrites, manipulators, sadists and masochists. He had danced with the clinically insane, and he had tangled with the most depraved minds. So, with his boundless experience, he was able to pinpoint with overwhelming accuracy that the little girl he had brought into his village was fucking crazy. The blind monster wasn't above swearing when the situation called for it, and the little girl had already proved herself back in that courtyard, acting like a shy schoolgirl confessing her love while slowly gouging out a man's eyes. But the more time Ken spent with her, the worse it got. It's almost as if she's a mix of the worst possible quirks a schizophrenic person is predisposed to having. She was a sadist with an overactive imagination. She sometimes even had trouble with her thoughts, getting caught up in her own little mind, and missing her prey while hunting. She was also, to some extent, masochistic. The last thing that Ken had expected when stringing her up in a trap was for her to actually be excited. And it wasn't just the excitement of a student seeing the possibilities of what they could do. It was almost as if she took almost sexual pleasure from just feeling the strings almost cut into her skin. Besides that, she was also violent, bloodthirsty, and her priorities were extremely skewed. Ken was unsure how to react when he sensed her show more hesitation while skinning a rabbit than when she had tortured a man. Better not dwell on it. I'll teach her as much as I can, but she'll be by herself most of the time. I'll just be there for guidance, in case it's needed. Ken allowed her to live in his mansion in one of the empty rooms, but she would also have to sleep outside 4 times per week in order to get used to sleeping on trees and rocks. She seemed to accept whatever training Ken had in mind, having no complaints at all, regardless of where she slept. Ken went to his office after letting the little girl settle in her new quarters. Saburo and Tosho, alongside the Uzumaki prodigy, were already waiting for him there. "Leader, good to have you back." The first blade stepped forward and took a knee in front of Ken, bowing his head as well. Saburo, the second blade, followed in his footsteps and also greeted Ken in a similar fashion. Kazu only nodded towards Ken, his hands crossed. He did stand up from his chair as a sign of respect. "It seems that you've brought back quite the unexpected baggage," Saburo muttered after his greeting, raising his head and looking at Ken directly. "Baggage indeed. She's the daemon's daughter. She'll be in our care from now on and will learn from us." Ken's words were like a bombshell. They dropped on top of the head of everyone in the room. Kazu especially stared at the blind assassin with wide eyes. What daemon in his right mind would allow his daughter to be trained by a group of bounty hunters? Besides the problem of rank and royal dignity, there was always the problem of safety. Was the daemon of the Land of Iron really that trusting of Ken? Or maybe he just didn't care about his daughter? I know you all have a lot of questions. Long story short, little Yu was adamant about me being her teacher, after encountering me once in the past, and after she proved herself more than just a spoiled little girl. I agreed to train her. You could say that her father owes me a lot now. Ken decided not to go into detail about how the girl had proven herself, or about how the daemon had thought that Yu was actually smitten with him at first. The people in the room also didn't ask any more questions. Ken had already quenched most of their curiosity. "Well, you arrived just in time. Sir Kazu is going to start his teachings today." Ken turned his head towards Saburo, who noticed that and continued speaking. "We ended up agreeing to postpone them momentarily, at least until you returned. We are well aware that you wish to learn Fuinjutsu as well." The strawman continued speaking with a smile on his mask-covered face. "I appreciate it." Ken turned his head towards Kazu and nodded. After that, Kazu went and prepared to begin his lessons, while Ken listened to Tosho's reports on the state of the Brotherhood and the progress of the children, among other things. Good, things are progressing steadily. Just as I had foreseen, the children are exceeding my expectations. Their determination and diligence are nothing if not commendable. Needless to say, Ken was extremely pleased with what he was hearing. Many of the children were already showing some semblance of mastery over Ken's original technique, presence control. Currently, only those above the age of 10 were allowed to start training it, and most of them were progressing nicely. It's only a matter of time before they become skilled enough to be let on missions. Ken sighed a bit when thinking about that. He only wanted the recruits that were 13 and above to go on missions, and virtually all of them would still be under supervision until they reached at least 16. Currently, only around 13 children fit the criteria, but Ken felt it was safer to have them train a bit more before sending them out. He still believed 13 to be quite young at the end of the day, but at 13, they would essentially become part-time bounty hunters, only going after the weakest bounties alongside Saburo's clone squads. Their tasks were going to mostly consist of seeing action on the field and possibly fighting the opponents Saburo or Tosho picked for them. In essence, they were only going to be in an internship program preparing them for their jobs at 16. But those were still plans for the future. The present was plenty interesting. As Kazu was preparing for his lessons, Akira was still at the bottom of the sea, searching for bodies while attempting to whistle underwater. It was boring work for the immortal bounty hunter. He had a small boat floating randomly above. He would sometimes resurface and eat there, but he spent most of his time underwater. He didn't need to breathe in order to not die, but drowning did hurt a bit. Thankfully, Akira's pain receptors were pretty numbed, so he was mostly feeling like he was getting stung in his lungs a bit. "I hate this job." Akira couldn't help but sigh underwater. The job wasn't bad because it was somewhat painful, but it was so boring. But one thing was for sure, this place is a fucking gold mine. I get why Leader was adamant about looting it. And so, Akira's work continued. It was going to take a while more, but the third blade felt that it was worth it. While he was struggling to find more stuff, Kazu was already greeting his students. The class began in force. Ken was also present, sat down and was ready to listen. He was not much of a visual learner, unfortunately, but listening was nice too. He could also envision the things that Kazu was either drawing or writing on the blackboard. He just had to pay attention to the strokes and movements of Uzumaki's wrist. At some point, he did decide to just open a window, allowing some wind in and giving him a better vision of what was on the board. He could feel the wind bending around the chalk-smeared blackboard, and the forms became more vivid in his mind thanks to that. Fuinjutsu, what a fascinating art. And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part, so be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, we'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out these videos right here for more awesome isekai anime content.